What's up, everyone? Quick favor before we start. If you like the stories, then please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. If you're on mobile, then hit the hype feature. It massively boosts these stories to new listeners. Also, I'm curious where in the world you're tuning in from, so leave your location in the comments. All right, enough talk. Let's jump into tonight's tale. The call came on a Tuesday, which was unusual. Most people go missing on weekends. The voice on the phone was a woman's, polished and tight with the kind of panic that hasn't quite accepted it's real yet. She'd been holding herself together for 24 hours and the seams were showing, but just barely. Women like that. Money in the family 3 generations deep. Private schools, the practiced calm of people who solve problems by throwing resources at them. They don't break easily. They just get quieter and quieter until something gives all at once. "My daughter," she said. "She went into the Glades yesterday. She hasn't come back." I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching a snowy egret work the shallows at the edge of my property. The Glades pressed up against my back fence, 80 feet of yard, and then the world ended and turned into something older and less patient. I'd lived here 15 years. I still didn't look out at it after dark. I asked where. She said, "The mangrove tunnels off the Turner River." I almost hung up right there. That's Glimp country. That's the stretch of swamp where Possum Tate took me when I was 22 years old, handed me a flashlight and a canteen and a folded piece of paper, and left me overnight with nothing but 6 rules and the instruction not to break any of them. I didn't sleep for 3 days after, not because of what I saw, because of what I almost saw, and the certainty, bone deep and permanent, that if I'd looked half a second longer, I'd have spent the rest of my life in a hospital room, staring at a wall. I took the job anyway. Her name was Carolyn Voss. Her daughter was Maya, 17. A junior naturalist award winner 2 years running, who'd apparently taken that distinction seriously enough to kayak into one of the most hostile ecosystems in North America alone at dawn, with no guide and no emergency beacon. They were staying at the Cypress Bay Lodge, a boutique property on the western edge of the Glades that charged $400 a night and advertised authentic wilderness experiences. The authentic wilderness had taken their daughter and the official search. State troopers, a Park Service boat, an airboat from the county had found nothing. Nothing. That's not what happens when a teenager tips her kayak and drowns. Drowning leaves things. The official search finding nothing meant Maya hadn't drowned. It meant she'd gone somewhere the search couldn't follow, or somewhere it instinctively didn't want to go without quite knowing why. I drove to Cypress Bay Lodge with my gear in the bed of my truck and the folded paper already in my shirt pocket. I'd put it there without thinking, the way you put on a seatbelt before a long drive. The husband, David Voss, shook my hand once, firm, and stepped back and let his wife do the talking. Carolyn Voss was maybe 48, and the last 24 hours had cost her something she normally kept locked down tight. Her eyes were raw at the edges, and she gripped her own wrist with her free hand the whole time we talked, a small, self-anchoring gesture she wasn't aware of. I asked the standard questions: departure time, kayak description, what she told the dock attendant, her gear, her phone, wrote it all down, kept my face neutral. "The Park Service boat went out for 6 hours, Carolyn Voss said. They said they covered the whole river corridor." "They covered what they could access," I said. "The Turner River opens into about 40 square miles of mangrove tunnels past the first channel bend. Passages in there a motor skiff can't navigate." She looked at me steadily. "The resort manager said you charge double your standard rate for certain types of cases." "I do." She didn't ask what types. Sometimes people hire you for your willingness to go somewhere they understand. On some animal level, you should not go. "Find my daughter," she said. The Turner River put-in is a concrete ramp off a county road, shaded by tall cypresses that cut the light even at midday. I launched the airboat at 9:45 into water that was high and dark, stained the color of old tea by tannins leaching from the mangrove roots. 3 weeks of above-average rainfall had pushed water levels up and changed the geometry of the tunnel systems. Deeper, darker, more of the root structure submerged. I ran the airboat south, following the main channel. The motor was loud enough that I didn't have to think for the first 10 minutes. Just movement, just the familiar geography of the river, the sawgrass giving way to the first dense press of red mangroves as I turned southeast. I was reading the water wrong from the start. No ibis, no cormorants, no anhinga spreading its wings on the low branches. The channel was animal empty in both directions, which doesn't happen. You are never the only living thing on the Turner River. We were the only living thing on the Turner River. I pulled on my waders and stepped off into water that came to mid-thigh and pushed through to the cockpit. The seat was still dry. She'd gotten out before the kayak tipped. On the seat, centered like it had been placed there, was a single drop of something dark, black, sticky. The consistency of pine sap, but holding the light differently, absorbing slightly more than it should. Rule 5. The glimp weeps from its empty eyes. Black sap. If you find it on your gear, you're in its territory. If you find it on your skin, you have 1 hour to reach moving water. The drop was on the seat, not the hull. It had dripped from above. The glimp had been leaning over the kayak, over where Maya had been sitting. I filed that and straightened slowly. That's when I felt it, starting at the back of my neck. Not pain, exactly. A prickling, crawling awareness, like the skin was trying to alert the brain to something the eyes hadn't processed yet. I know that feeling. I've felt it 6 times in 15 years working glimp country, and each time it has been exactly what it felt like. Real, immediate, and not to be argued with. Rule 6. You will feel it before you see it. A prickling on the back of your neck. A sudden cold. The overwhelming urge to turn around. Do not turn around. The glimp wants you to look. It feeds on the moment of recognition. Every primate instinct I had was screaming at me to turn, to face whatever was behind me before it got any closer. I didn't turn. I stared at the kayak seat and breathed in through the nose, out through the mouth. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The cold hit at 7, a localized temperature drop, coming from directly behind me. I felt it cross my shoulders. Something large was close enough to change the air around me. 15. My hand found the pole without instruction. Not as a weapon, just something solid, to keep the hand from shaking. 30. A sound to my right. Soft, liquid, water displacement. An alligator or a gar. The glimp makes no sound when it moves. Whatever made that noise was ordinary life, which meant it was over there. The thing behind me was still perfectly silent, which was worse. 50. I noticed I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. 70. The cold held steady, not intensifying, not retreating. Possum said the glimp doesn't have urgency the way animals do. It waits for the moment of recognition. The moment you look, that's when it moves. 98, 99, 100. I looked at the water, not behind me, at the water. Rule 2. Still water is a gift. The glimp cannot hide from water. It shows up clear as day in any reflection. But if you see it in the water, it sees you too. You have seconds to move. Between 2 mangrove roots, 4 feet to my right, there was a still patch of water, maybe 12 inches across, protected from any current, flat as a coin. I angled my gaze toward it carefully, not directly. Let my peripheral vision slide across its surface. I saw it. A tall figure, pale as bone, occupying the space directly behind me. Not standing, folded somehow into the gap between two mangrove trunks that couldn't have held a cat, let alone something that tall. Its proportions were wrong in a way the eye kept trying to smooth over and couldn't manage. Too long in the torso, arms at angles suggesting additional joints, and where the face should have been, empty sockets. Not damaged, not gouged, just empty, the way a mask has eye holes. And from both of them, slow and black, the sap tracked down what should have been cheekbones and dripped from the thing's chin into the water below. It was looking at my reflection. Rule 2. If you see it in the water, it sees you too. You have seconds. I moved. Not panicked. Panic in chest-deep water gets you killed. You slip, you go under, you thrash. I moved with deliberate speed, which is different from fast and harder to sustain. Sideways, not backward, not toward it, 3 steps to my left, eyes still on that still patch of water to my right. In the reflection, I saw the pale figure unfold slightly, one of those wrong-jointed arms reaching toward where I'd been standing. I reached the airboat, found the hull, swung up into it in one motion, and fired the engine before I was fully seated, the prop blast shaking the mangroves, blowing a spray of water across the roots. I ran the boat forward, deeper into the passage. Not back. Back meant turning around, and I was not turning around. The passage widened after 30 seconds into a small lagoon, maybe 40 feet across. I cut the engine and drifted into the shadow of an overhang. Looked back. The puddle between the roots was gone, broken by my wake. The space between the trunks was empty. Just shadow. Just root. Just the dripping of disturbed water going still again. I looked at my hands. They weren't shaking. That surprises me every time. I sat in the shadow of the overhang and breathed for a minute. The silence held. No birds had returned. The glimp was still close, where I was deep enough in its territory that the swamp was staying quiet out of old, earned caution. Those two conditions are not very different from each other. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out the paper. Folded so many times, it's soft as cloth now. That's not a figure of speech. The fibers have broken down from years of handling and humidity until the thing is more textile than document. I didn't unfold it. I know what it says. I've read it enough times that I could recite it in complete darkness, which I have done more than once in the years since Possum disappeared. 6 rules. 2 of them had already kept me alive in the first hour. Rule 6, the count, the discipline of not turning, and Rule 2, the reflection. Rule 5 had told me I was in territory before anything else. Rule 3 had told me it was close. Maya Voss had been here since yesterday morning. The glimp had dripped on her seat, dripped on it while she sat in it, and she'd gotten out and run. Without rules. On raw instinct. That she'd run at all was what kept her alive this long. She'd made the right call in the moment. Gotten out of the kayak, moved, put distance between herself and the glimp before it had her locked. People do that sometimes. The body knows things the mind doesn't have language for yet. But instinct has a shelf life. It burns through fast when the stakes are this high and the rules are this specific. I needed to find her before hers ran out. I put the paper back in my pocket and took out my GPS. Marked the lagoon, noted the kayak location, wrote the time and the sap description and the reflection sighting in my notebook. Evidence. Same discipline I'd kept for 20 years tracking animals and people and the things that don't fit cleanly into either category. The glimp knew I was here now. It had seen my reflection at the same moment I'd seen it in mine. That's the symmetry Rule 2 doesn't advertise. It had reached for me and missed, and Possum always said that matters. He said the glimp is a studying thing. Every time it misses you, it's updating its model of how you move and how you think. Every time you survive it, it knows you a little better. That's what I had to work with. A thing that was learning me. In swamp it knew far better than I did. hunting a girl who had no rules and no guide and no idea what she was running from. I picked up the pole and pushed the airboat forward, one slow length at a time. The mangrove canopy closed overhead until the light was green and filtered and wrong, the kind of light that makes distances unreliable. I moved the way Possum taught me, eyes in peripheral sweep, checking the reflections in every still patch of water I passed, never fixing on any one point. Nothing showed in any of them, which wasn't reassurance, which just meant the glimp was somewhere I wasn't looking. The silence stayed complete. I moved into it anyway. That's the job. You go where the evidence takes you, you follow the rules, and you try to stay alive long enough to bring someone home. The glimp was in these tunnels with both of us now. It knew I was hunting it. I had the paper in my pocket, soft as cloth. I kept going. The airboat was too loud for the tunnels, and too wide for where I needed to go. I'd known that going in. Past the lagoon where I'd sheltered after the reflection encounter, past the first major split, the passages narrowed to the width of a man's shoulders, in some places less. The airboat had gotten me as far as it could get me. I tied it to a prop root thick as my thigh, triple knotted the bowline, and ran a second line 3 feet back. Not because of current. There was no current in here, the water black and still as old glass, but because I'd be coming back to it in the dark, possibly in a hurry, and a boat that had drifted even 6 inches in the wrong direction was a boat I couldn't find by feel. I lowered the canoe off the rear rack without a splash. That matters. Sound in the deep tunnels carries differently than in open water. The mangrove canopy baffles it, redirects it, does strange things to directionality. A loud noise in here doesn't echo clean. It smears. And I needed my ears for the one thing they were actually useful for out here. Detecting the absence of everything else. The silence was still absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind in the leaves above because the canopy was too dense for wind to reach. Just the soft sound of my paddle entering the water, the drip off the blade when I lifted it. And underneath both of those, nothing. The specific, pressing nothing that Rule 3 had named. I paddled slowly, keeping strokes short and controlled, checking both water surfaces at every turn. Rule 2. Near side, far side, ahead, repeat. Never the same sequence twice running, because patterns are predictable and predictable gets you killed. I was maybe 20 minutes past the airboat when I found the first footprint. It was in the silt at the base of a prop root, a small shelf of sediment that had built up over years. Small. A water shoe, rubber sole, mesh upper, pointed toward the deeper tunnels. The edge definition was still sharp, which in this mud meant 12 hours, maybe less. She'd been moving fast, the toe dug in, the heel print shallow. Not waiting with purpose. Fleeing. I marked the position on my GPS and kept moving. The second sign came 10 minutes later, a strip of orange fabric caught on a branch stub at chest height. Nylon. Waterproof. Matching the rain jacket description Carolyn Voss had given me. Torn, not cut. She'd been moving fast enough to snag it without noticing, or had noticed and kept going anyway. Same information either way. The third sign stopped me cold, wedged into a crevice in a mangrove root about 4 feet above the waterline. A small rectangle of white, protected from humidity by the overhang above it. Waterproof paper, folded once. The handwriting was hurried but legible. She'd pressed hard. It's behind me. I can't see it, but I feel it. If anyone finds this, don't follow. I read it twice, folded it, and put it in my vest pocket. Don't follow. She'd written it knowing someone might come looking. She was trying to protect whoever came after her. Some part of her brain was still functioning past pure survival instinct. She hadn't completely broken yet. That was the best information I'd gotten all day. I kept following. The hummock appeared 20 minutes later, materializing out of the tunnel like something the swamp had been hiding deliberately. A dry hummock. A small island of elevated ground, higher than the surrounding water table. Thick with saw palmetto and young cypress, maybe 40 feet across. I'd worked the Turner River corridor for 15 years, and I didn't have it on any map I'd ever seen. Either the elevated water level had shifted the approach routes enough that it was newly accessible, or it had always been here, and every person who'd found it before had not come back to report it. Both possibilities were equally unwelcome. I beached the canoe on the muddy edge and stood in the shallows, just listening, just watching the water around me in that unfocused, peripheral way. Nothing moved in any of the reflections. The silence was not just absolute, it was specific, the kind of silence that has a center. On the hummock, half collapsed into the palmetto scrub, was a chickee hut. Old, the wood silver gray with age, the palmetto thatch roof caved in on one side, the elevated floor platform tilted where 2 support posts had rotted through. Seminal construction, probably 100 years old or more, except one person had been here recently. Flattened palmetto where someone had pushed through. Disturbed mud at the base of the platform where someone had climbed up. I waded ashore and approached. The sap was on the first post I passed, black, weeping, freshly bled, wet enough to stick. Not territory marking the way the kayak seat drop had been. This was active occupation. I checked the next post. More sap, and the next. Every post of the chickee that I could see had the same mark at roughly chest height on a tall man, which meant it hadn't dripped down from anything that moves the way a man moves. Rule 5. The sap is how it marks its hunting ground. This wasn't just territory. This was a feeding ground. Visited regularly enough that the sap was still wet. I stopped the rest of that thought and climbed up onto the tilted platform. Maya's backpack was in the far corner, wedged between 2 warped floorboards to keep it from sliding down the slope. Dark blue day pack, technical hiking frame. I went through it fast without moving it. Water bottle half empty, granola bar sealed, field notebook swollen with humidity, dead phone, unopened first aid kit. She'd been here. She'd left in a hurry. She'd left without her pack. I looked up. In the corner of the chickee, just past the collapsed section of roof, there was a gap in the floorboards. Not rot, not structural failure. Clean-edged, as though something had separated the boards with precision, creating a space roughly 18 inches long and 4 inches wide. A space that shouldn't exist in the floor of a chickee hut. A space that by any reasonable assessment couldn't hold anything larger than a small animal. Rule 4. Always check the spaces that shouldn't hold a body. Always look where something could be folded. That's where it waits. I checked it. I crossed the tilted floor to the corner, crouched down over the gap, and looked into it. Black water below. The smell of deep mud. The gap ran the full width of the boards, and I could see through to the waterlogged ground 3 feet beneath the platform. Nothing visible. Nothing. Something moved in my peripheral vision. To the left. Low and fast and large. Larger than it should have been in that corner of the hut, where the collapsed roof had reduced the available space to something too cramped for anything bigger than a raccoon. Every trained instinct I have said, don't look directly. Widen your gaze. Let it come to you at the edge of your vision where you can see it without it knowing. I snapped my head left and looked directly at it. 20 years of experience. 15 years knowing the rule. I broke it anyway, in under a second, without a conscious decision. The movement in my peripheral vision triggered something older and faster than training. 1 second. That's how long it lasted. It was unfolded. That was the only word I had for it. Unfolded. The way something compressed into an impossibly small space expands to its full extent. Except its full extent was wrong in a way I don't have clean language for. Too tall for the space it occupied, which should have been impossible given the collapsed roof. Standing at angles that didn't account for gravity the way standing things are supposed to. The torso too long, the arms too long. The joints bending in directions joints don't bend. Empty sockets, fixed on my face, weeping black. Then my brain did what brains do when they encounter something with no category. It rejected the image, not gradually, instantly. One frame I was seeing it, the next I was staring at the corner of a collapsed chickie hut. Warped gray boards, fallen thatch, nothing else. The image erased itself the way a dream dissolves 3 seconds after waking. But the cold was there. The ambient cold of the tunnels had narrowed to something focused and immediate. The same cold I'd felt behind me at the kayak site, but now in front of me and to the left. And I was crouched with my weight forward in the worst possible position for moving fast. I had looked directly at it. Rule 1. Broken. The displaced air hit next. A pressure change, a wave of movement from something massive shifting its weight in a space that could not have held it. I didn't wait for what came after. I dropped. Off the side of the elevated platform, into the water and mud below. 3 feet of drop, and I hit the bottom with my knees and palms and went completely under. Black water, cold, tannin and rot in my mouth. I pushed off the bottom and came up moving, wading as fast as you can wade in chest-deep water through a mangrove root system, which is not fast enough, and I knew it. Behind me, nothing. No sound, no splash. The glimp makes no sound when it moves. That's the worst part of it. You can't track it by ear. You can only track it by what it does to everything else. I needed still water, and I was making everything move. There was a slough to my left, a slightly deeper channel between the hummock's edge and a dense root cluster, 6 feet of open water surface. I angled toward it, got my feet under me, and stopped. Standing chest deep in the black water, I stopped moving, held myself still, let the surface settle. 4 seconds. 4 seconds of standing in the silence, feeling the cold at my back, not looking behind me, not turning. Then the surface of the slough flattened out. I looked at it. Behind me and to the right, at the hummock's muddy edge, the glimp was in the water, its reflection sharp and complete in the settling surface. Tall, pale, wrong. One long arm extended toward where I'd been standing on the platform, reaching for the space I'd vacated when I dropped. It had missed by the margin of my fall. It was already turning toward me. The canoe was beached 10 feet to my left along the hummock's edge. I moved left, perpendicular, not away from it, not toward it, keeping my eyes down, using the reflection to track the pale shape. I saw it orient toward me, saw one of those wrong-jointed arms extend again. My hand found the canoe hull. I shoved it out from the bank, swung into it in one motion, got the paddle in the water, and pulled hard. The canoe shot forward into the tunnel entrance, and I pulled again and again. And I was in the passage, and the hummock was behind me, and the only sound in the world was my paddle and my breathing and the drip off the blade. I paddled hard, blind. I didn't look back. 2 minutes before the cold faded to something less immediate, less acute threat, and more close pursuit. Still behind me, just further back. I paddled for another 3 minutes before I let myself slow enough to look at my arms. Right arm, nothing. Left arm, between the wrist and elbow, on the inside of the forearm, a smear of black sap the size and shape of 4 fingers pressed together. Not a drip, not a territory mark. The pattern of direct contact. The glimp had touched me, had reached through the water during those 4 seconds I'd held still, letting the surface settle. I'd felt nothing. No sting, no impact, no sensation whatsoever. That was worse than pain would have been. Rule 5, if you find it on your skin, you've already been touched. You have 1 hour to reach open water. The glimp cannot cross deep water with a current. 1 hour. I took out my GPS. The Turner River channel, nearest moving water, tidal influence keeping a slow real current through even at low tide, was 2.3 miles from my current position through the tunnel system. Open water, 25 minutes. In the tunnels, with turns and route obstacles and reflection checks at every bend, closer to 45. 45 minutes to moving water, 15 minutes of margin. I'd held still for 4 seconds at the hummock, 2 minutes paddling before I checked, 3 minutes after, 9 minutes gone from my hour, 51 left. The sap on my arm was already warm, not body temperature warm, slightly warmer than that, the way a healing bruise runs hot. I watched it for 5 seconds. It pulsed, slow, regular, synced to my heartbeat. Possum had never told me what happened if you didn't make the hour. He'd just said 1 hour, with the flat certainty of a man who had observed what came before and after that threshold and was not interested in describing the after. The specificity of the number, not quickly, not as soon as possible, but 1 hour, exactly, suggested precision. A mechanism with a definite edge. I did not want to find out what was on the other side of that edge. I checked the reflection to my left. Still water, mangrove shadow, nothing pale. I checked the right. Same. Behind me, the hummock. Gone now in the tunnel's green dark. In front of me, 45 minutes of tunnel system, a broken rule, and a countdown already running on my arm. I put the paddle in the water. I started counting seconds under my breath. And I didn't look back. The tunnels all looked the same after the first 10 minutes. That's not a complaint. I wasn't lost, not technically. I had the GPS and the compass and 15 years of this corridor burned into the part of my brain that handles spatial memory. But the deep mangrove system past the hummock was old growth, undisturbed, and in the elevated water, all the usual landmarks were submerged or rearranged. Every passage looked like every other passage. Green light filtered through the canopy in the same flat, directionless way. I paddled by compass heading and counted my strokes. The sap on my arm had been warm since I found it. Now, 12 minutes out from the hummock, it was hot. Not burning. I still had full sensation, still had grip strength, but running noticeably above body temperature, the way a bad infection feels before it becomes a fever. I checked it when I could spare the attention. Same smear, same forefinger shape, slightly darker than before. I didn't check it more than I had to. Watching the GPS clock was more useful. 43 minutes remaining. 2 miles to the Turner River channel. In the tunnels, with the turns and the route obstacles and the reflection checks at every bend. Closer to 45 minutes of paddling. The math was already thin, and it wasn't getting better. The silence had not broken. Not once in the 12 minutes since the hummock. The Glades at full noise is a continuous orchestral performance. There is always something alive and announcing its aliveness somewhere within earshot. The Glades at this kind of silence is a different place entirely, operating under different rules. Rule 3, the scariest sound in the Glades is absolute silence. When the bugs stop, when the birds go quiet, when even the wind holds its breath, the glimp is close. I could feel the weight of it at my back. Not the prickling of Rule 6 that had faded about 5 minutes after I'd cleared the hummock. Something more diffuse, the particular pressure of being tracked. I checked the reflections at every turn, left, right, ahead, and nothing showed in any of them, which didn't mean it wasn't there. It meant it hadn't positioned itself at the edge of any still water mirror I'd managed to check. Those were not the same thing. At the 30-minute mark, 1.1 miles remaining, 15 minutes of margin still intact. I was maintaining pace. Then I heard the splash. Ahead of me, around a bend in the passage, maybe 40 feet. A single heavy splash, the sound a person makes when they lose their footing in water. Not a controlled step. A fall. Weight and panic, and no grace at all. Then the silence slammed back down. The glimp makes no sound when it moves. That splash had been real, produced by something with mass and no coordination. I brought the canoe forward, one careful stroke at a time, past the bend, into a wider section of tunnel where the canopy opened to let in a column of gray afternoon light. She was waist-deep in the water, maybe 25 feet ahead of me. Orange rain jacket, dark pants. One water shoe missing from her right foot. Facing away from me, toward the far end of the passage, standing completely still. Both arms at her sides, her head tilted slightly, the way you tilt when you're trying to hear something at the edge of perception. She was staring at the empty air at the end of the passage. Not at anything I could see. Just tunnel, roots, water, shadow. Nothing there. Nothing I could see. Maya Voss was alive. I understood the mechanics in the 2 seconds it took to register. The glimp positions itself in the exact center of a person's direct field of vision, in the blind spot where the brain edits out what it doesn't want to process. She saw nothing, because that's what the glimp was to direct vision, but the body knew. Every animal nerve she had was screaming that something was wrong about that specific patch of empty air. She was transfixed, frozen between the instinct to run and the older instinct that said, "Don't look away from the predator." Except, looking is the problem, not looking away. I brought the canoe against a root mass and kept my voice low and level. The professional voice, the one that says, "I've done this before. You're going to be fine if you do exactly what I say." Maya. She didn't move. "Maya, don't look at it. Look at me. Look at my face." Her shoulders tightened. She'd heard me, but her gaze stayed locked on that empty patch of tunnel. I understood that too. Looking away from the glimp when it's standing in your direct field of vision is not a natural act. Every survival instinct insists on visual confirmation of a threat before disengaging. The glimp lives in that instinct. It exploits the exact reflex evolution built to keep you alive, turning it into a trap. She couldn't look away on her own. I needed to give her somewhere else to go. But I needed to confirm its position first. I took my canteen from my vest, aluminum, flat-sided, and poured a slow stream of water onto the surface of a broad-leafed mangrove plant growing low from the root mass beside me, letting it pool in the leaf's natural cup until I had a shallow mirror 4 inches across. I lifted it, angled it past Maya toward the end of the tunnel she was facing, used my peripheral vision on the surface. There. Unfolded to its full height in the narrow end of the passage. Pale, wrong, the proportions all off in the ways I'd already cataloged in the Chicky Hut. Too tall, too long, the arm joints describing angles with no anatomical name. The empty sockets tilted toward Maya, toward the top of her head, not her face, which meant it was waiting, not in the act yet, waiting for her to do the one thing that would trigger whatever came next, waiting for her to look directly at it. I checked the sap on my arm without lowering the leaf mirror. Still hot, still pulsing, still counting. "Maya," louder now. "When I count to 3, close your eyes. Don't ask questions. Close your eyes and swim toward my voice. Don't open them until you feel my hand." She made a sound. Small, not a word, but she'd heard me and was processing it. I took that for yes. 1. In the leaf mirror, the pale figure hadn't moved. The tilt of the empty sockets may have increased fractionally, dropping slightly lower toward her face. It was reacting to my voice. 2. Maya's hands came up slightly. The reflex that precedes closing your eyes when everything in you is insisting they stay open. 3. She closed her eyes. She went under for half a second, lost her footing, dropped to shoulder depth, and then she was moving, swimming blind, arms pulling through the black water in a desperate, uncoordinated stroke. The most deliberate thing I'd seen her do since I'd found her. In the leaf mirror, the glimp did not move toward her. Possum had told me once, in the oblique way he told me things, as observation, not instruction, that the glimp needs the moment of recognition. The eye contact, the moment when the prey acknowledges what it's seeing. Without that trigger, the mechanism doesn't engage. Maya had closed her eyes and denied it the trigger. In the reflection, A tilt of the head that functioned like confusion in a thing that had no face to be confused with. 7 seconds of stillness. Then a lateral shift. The glimp beginning to move sideways along the tunnel wall, compressing into the gap between the passage's narrowest point and the root mass, repositioning. Rule 4. Always look where something could be folded. That's where it waits. It was finding a new angle. I didn't give it time. Maya's hand hit the canoe hull. I grabbed her wrist, cold, shaking, and pulled her up and over the gunwale. Not gentle, not trying to be. She landed on her hands and knees in the bilge water with her eyes still closed, and I had the paddle in the water before she'd finished orienting herself. Stay down. Eyes closed. Hold the sides. I paddled, hard and fast, back to the junction and left, the direct line to the Turner River channel. Not the way I'd come in, not toward the repositioning pale shape in the reflection behind me. I checked the water as I moved. Nothing in the surfaces to either side, nothing ahead. The cold was everywhere now, ambient rather than localized, the entire tunnel system running below temperature. The glimp was moving somewhere I couldn't see it, which, after the broken Rule 1, I'd been half expecting. It knew me better now. It had my scent, in whatever sense that metaphor was accurate, and it was hunting differently, not from a fixed position. Moving. I paddled faster. 15 minutes in, I stopped counting minutes. Counting was not helping, and paddling was. I drove the canoe through the tunnel system on compass and GPS and the muscle memory of 15 years, checking reflections, navigating turns, keeping Maya low in the bow where her weight was centered and the canoe ran stable. She was quiet, which was the best thing she could do for both of us. After a few minutes, she started counting softly under her breath, 1 to 10 and back again, some kind of self-regulation. The thing the brain reaches for when the rational mind has nothing useful to offer. I didn't tell her to stop. The sound of it was proof she was still functional. The sap went from hot to burning somewhere around the 12-minute mark. Heat without pain. The kind of signal that means the damage is past the point where warning is useful. I pressed my elbow against my side and paddled with my shoulders. At 7 minutes on the clock, I smelled the river. Moving water in the glades has a specific character. Cleaner, more oxygenated, carrying the faint salt influence of the tidal reach. After 2 hours in the still water tunnels, where the air had the flat, mineral quality of something long enclosed, the river smell arrived like a change in pressure. The tunnel widened. The canopy thinned. Late afternoon light came in directional and gold instead of the flat, filtered green of the deep passages. One more turn. The passage opened into the Turner River channel. Current. Slow but real. Tidal reach keeping the water moving, the surface broken, carrying tannin foam and floating debris downstream. I drove the canoe through the tunnel mouth and into it. The moment we crossed from still water into current, the sap went cold. Not gradually. A switch. The pulsing stopped. The heat stopped. The sense of being tethered to something at the other end of it stopped. I looked at my arm as the canoe turned in the current and watched the smear go matte and flat, and then, over about 15 seconds, begin to flake at its edges like dried mud. Rule 5. The glimp cannot cross deep water with a current. It can only hunt in the still places. 7 minutes to spare. I grounded the canoe on a sandbar in the middle of the channel. A low spit of white sand built up on the inside of a broad bend, and put the paddle down. Looked back at the tunnel mouth. Dark. Still. Nothing pale moved in the broken current near the entrance. "Maya," I said, "open your eyes." She opened them. She looked at the open channel, the wide sky, the late afternoon light coming in low and gold over the sawgrass on the far bank. She looked at it all the way. You look at something you thought you'd never see again. Then the shaking started. Real shaking, full body, the kind that comes when the adrenaline runs out and the body starts taking inventory of everything it's been through. She wrapped her arms around herself and shook. I checked the sap. Most of it was gone now, flaking away into the current. The skin underneath was pale and smooth and slightly different in texture than the skin around it. I pressed my thumb to it. No sensation, just pressure. A patch 3 inches across that had gone quiet. I noted it and moved on. "I saw it," Maya said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough with cold and hours of not speaking. "When I opened my eyes, just for a second, it had no face." She was looking at the tunnel mouth. I looked at it too. What she'd seen was the edge of it, the shape of the absence, the outline of the negative space, the dream image that recedes as you wake. She'd opened her eyes in motion, already crossing into moving water, the canoe carrying her out of the still places before the image could fully register. She'd gotten the moment before seeing it, not the thing itself. That was why she was alive. She'd denied it the moment of recognition, closed her eyes at the critical second, and swum blind toward a stranger's voice in the dark. Not because she knew the rules, because some part of her had understood, below the level of language, that seeing it was the wrong answer. Smart girl. Or lucky. I've found the two are harder to separate than most people think. "What was it?" she asked. "The swamp," I said. "Just the swamp." She looked at the tunnel mouth one more time. Then she looked away, which was exactly the right thing to do. The current ran south around the sandbar, carrying the last flakes of black sap downstream. The light was holding, but it wouldn't hold much longer. We had miles of river still to cover, and I had an airboat to get back to or abandon, and the Voss family was waiting at the Cypress Bay Lodge, expecting a phone call I'd promised by nightfall. None of that was the immediate problem. The immediate problem was that we'd used 48 of our 51 minutes on the clock. We were alive. Maya was alive. The sap was gone, and the rule about moving water was still true. 7 minutes to spare. That would have to be enough. The sandbar gave us maybe 10 minutes before I made myself move. Maya had stopped shaking, not because she was warm, but because her body had run through the acute phase and settled into the dull, deep cold that hypothermia moves into when it isn't being treated. She was sitting in the bilge water of the canoe with her knees pulled up, staring at the sawgrass on the far bank. Not at the tunnel mouth. That was progress. I checked her eyes. Pupils equal. Tracking. She knew where she was. "We have to move," I said. "Can you paddle?" She took the paddle I held out without answering. The sun had dropped below the mangrove line while we'd rested. The light was still there. 40 minutes of it, maybe. But it had gone amber and flat. The long, horizontal light of late afternoon sliding toward dusk. I've guided fishing trips on this river at every hour for 20 years. It's beautiful at dusk. It's also when the wading birds come in to roost and the light plays tricks with the reflections. When still water looks like moving water, and moving water looks like glass. Possum Tate had said it once. In the offhand way he said things he expected you to file away. The glimp favors the dissolving light. Dusk and dawn. When the eyes are recalibrating, that's when it's hardest to read the water clean. I'd filed it. I was using it now. "Paddle," I said, and put the canoe into the current. The Turner River Channel runs roughly north from the tunnel junction to the county road put-in where I'd launched that morning. 4 miles, with a broad westward bend 2/3 of the way up. In the canoe with the tidal current doing some of the work, an hour, maybe less. We had 40 minutes of usable light. I didn't tell Maya that. The current was stronger than the morning, outgoing tide adding maybe half a knot to our pace. The channel surface was moving and broken, and gold in the late light, which made it nearly useless for Rule 2. I used the bank margins instead, the still water in the root systems where current didn't reach, where the surface stayed flat. Left bank, right bank, left, alternating, every 30 seconds. The broken center of the river was no good as a mirror. The still margins were all I had. 15 minutes into the paddle, the waiting birds stopped. Not the gradual quiet of birds settling for the night. The abrupt stop, every bird on both banks, simultaneously, mid-call. The way a power cut kills every light in a room at once. Rule 3. When the birds go quiet, when even the wind holds its breath, the glimp is close. But we were in moving water. The glimp couldn't be in the channel. I looked at the western bank and saw the problem. 3 weeks of elevated rainfall had created a belt of flooded root systems along the western edge, maybe 8 feet wide in places, 15 in others, where completely still water sat between the moving channel and the mangrove wall. Not current. Still. Technically outside the channel. Rule 5's protection applied to current, and that margin wasn't current. The glimp could reach the still margin. If it could reach from the still margin to us in the moving water, I angled the canoe hard right toward the center of the channel and paddled. 25 minutes in, we came around the broad westward bend, and I saw the airboat, tied where I'd left it, in the small pocket of calm water at the east bank. But sitting wrong. The stern was down by 3 inches. Not a water shipping problem, no water coming in over the transom. Something inside the hull was adding weight. "Stop paddling," I said. "Stay still." I let the canoe drift and checked the still water pocket at the mooring, peripheral, careful. The surface there was flat as a mirror, protected from current on all sides, and in that mirror, folded into the space between the airboat hull and the waterline. A pale shape, long and wrong in the familiar way. The arm geometry visible even at this distance, shoulder line too high, elbow placement wrong, one arm extended under the hull as if bracing. It had moved ahead of us through the still water margins of the river system, arrived at the airboat before we did, and folded itself into the hull to wait. It had been there for however long we'd been paddling from the sandbar. Rule 4. The glimp can fit anywhere. Under your boat? It fits. Always check the spaces that shouldn't hold a body. I'd checked when I launched. I hadn't checked when I came back. That was the error I was living with. 2 options. Neither good. Option 1. Approach the airboat. The mooring pocket was still water, glimp territory. Getting close enough to untie lines meant entering that pocket with the glimp 3 feet away inside the hull. Option 2. Abandon the boat, take the canoe to the put-in. But the western bank's still water margin ran the entire remaining 1.5 miles of channel. If the glimp left the airboat and moved into that margin, it had a parallel corridor of still water all the way to the put-in. 1.5 miles of hunting ground running alongside us in the dark. Possum had said, "You don't have to beat it. You just have to be less wrong than it expects you to be." The glimp was in a defined space. A shape I knew. A position I had. Rule 4 cuts both ways. If you know where it's folded, you know exactly where it is. That's the only time in any engagement with the glimp that you have that advantage. It was in the airboat hull, in the still water pocket, and it hadn't moved because it didn't know I'd seen it. I'd read it peripherally, not with a direct gaze, so Rule 2's symmetry hadn't triggered. I reached into my vest for the flare gun. Marine unit, 12 gauge, single shot, loaded. I'd carried it for 3 years without firing it in the field. I broke the barrel, confirmed the load by feel, closed it without taking my eyes off the marginal reflection. I raised the gun and aimed at the still water reflection of the hull, not at the boat itself, at the reflected image. The geometry of reflection places the real object exactly where the reflected image appears to be. I was pointing at the hull through its own mirror. I fired. The sound hammered the river corridor. The flare crossed 30 feet and hit the hull at the waterline. Magnesium caught. Fiberglass burns fast, it's plastic with pretensions, and the flame spread in the rolling orange way fiberglass burns, with dense black smoke and no hesitation. In the reflection, the pale shape moved. Fast, faster than anything I'd seen it move across this entire day, which is saying something. It unfolded from the hull in one convulsive motion and hit the water on the far side of the airboat. Still water, east bank margin, and then it was into the roots and gone. Into the dark, between the mangroves, into whatever folded space the east bank provided. No sound, no splash, nothing. The airboat burned. That boat had 14 years on it. I'd rebuilt the engine myself, twice. I watched it go in the reflection because looking directly at a burning thing at dusk destroys your night vision, and I needed my night vision, and the practical consideration of that made me feel like myself again in a way that nothing else in the past 30 seconds had managed. I put the flare gun back in my vest. "Paddle," I said. We covered the last mile in the dark. Not full dark. A thin light still held in the western sky when the put-in came into view. The concrete ramp, pale gray in the dusk. 2 silhouettes at the water's edge. Carolyn Voss had driven out and waited when I hadn't called by nightfall, which was the only thing a person in her position could do. I checked the margins one final time as we came in. Both banks. Still water pockets. The gap under the concrete ramp. The dark space where current didn't reach. Peripheral, systematic. Nothing showed. The canoe hit the ramp and Carolyn Voss was in the water before I'd shipped the paddle, and she had Maya by both arms, and Maya let herself be held with the dead, passive weight of someone who has spent everything they had. David Voss stood at the top of the ramp with his jaw set in the way of a man releasing 40 hours of controlled fear into something manageable. Gratitude is what you get when the worst-case scenario doesn't happen. After a minute, Carolyn Voss looked up at me over her daughter's shoulder. "What happened?" she said. "She got turned around in the tunnels. Dehydration, mild hypothermia. Kept herself in the shallows. I found her about 2 miles in." I looked at Maya when I said it. She was watching me from her mother's arms. The specific expression of someone who knows the story they're being given isn't the story and understands, without needing it explained, why that's the right call. "She'll be fine. Warm her up, hydrate her. She'll sleep 12 hours and feel mostly normal after." David Voss shook my hand at the ramp and asked about the airboat. I told him it had sustained field damage. He added it to whatever number he was running and didn't ask what kind of field damage burns a fiberglass hull to the waterline. Some people are good at not asking the questions they don't want answered. They drove away. Taillights around the curve on the county road, and then just the river and the dark and the sound of the current. The wading birds started calling again from the Sawgrass Islands downstream. A great blue barked once from the near dark, then another, the ambient sound of the river coming back on, instrument by instrument. The silence had broken. The glimp had moved off. I stood on the concrete ramp by myself for a minute, listening to the birds come back, and then I loaded the canoe onto my trailer and drove home. My shack sits where the glades press up against the edge of the county road, 80 feet of yard, and then the world ends. I've been here 15 years. I know every sound the place makes at night. Nothing was off. I ate cold rice and beans at the kitchen table and drank 1 beer and didn't look directly at the back window. The yard was empty. The swamp was running its normal catalog, frogs in the ditch, the great horned owl on its usual line to the south. No hard silence, no held breath. Just ordinary swamp doing ordinary things in the dark. I washed the plate and went into the bathroom. The sap was long gone, flaked away hours ago in the river current. What remained was the mark it left, a patch of skin on the inside of my left forearm, palm-sized, pale and smooth, the texture slightly different from the surrounding skin. Settled, permanent looking. I pressed my thumb into the center of it. Nothing. Not numbness. Numbness implies something being suppressed. This was the absence of the nerve signal itself, like pressing on a photograph of skin rather than the skin. I held my arm under the light for a moment. Then I looked up at the mirror, my own face. Behind me, the bathroom door, the dark hallway, the kitchen light through the far doorway. For 1 second, the mirror showed something in the hallway that the direct view hadn't. Not a shape, not a figure. A quality of the darkness at the hallway's edge, a density, a specific wrongness in the way the shadow sat at the doorframe, as if the space it occupied was folded rather than open. Then it was just a hallway. I didn't turn around. I fixed my eyes on my own reflection and counted. 1, 2. The cold arrived at around 20. That localized, focused cold I knew by now as well as I knew any sensation in my body. I kept counting. 50. 60. The cold began to fade at 80, was gone by 93. I reached 100. I looked at the hallway in the mirror first. Then I turned and looked at it directly. Empty. Kitchen light through the far doorway. The normal dark. I turned the bathroom light off and went to bed. Possum used to say, "You don't kill the glimp. You can't. You just survive it. And every time you survive, it learns a little more about you." I looked at my arm in the morning, the dead patch of skin, palm-sized and permanent, and thought about what it had learned today. It had learned I use water as a mirror, that I count to 100, that I move sideways instead of back, that I'll burn a 14-year-old airboat rather than give it a fixed position. I wondered if it knew my name now. I wondered if the hallway had been hunting, or just attention. The particular quality of focus a thing develops for something it's decided is worth remembering. Those two things might not be different with the glimp. I folded the paper, put it back in my shirt pocket. There would be another call. There always was. Another voice on the phone with the specific timbre of panic that hasn't quite accepted it's real yet. And I would go back into the still places with the 6 rules and the dead patch of skin and the permanent cold I'd carry in that bathroom mirror from now on, for the rest of my life, every time I looked too long at my own reflection. Because that's the job, and the rules are still in my pocket, soft as cloth, waiting for the next time the silence falls. Three weeks passed and I stopped checking my arm in the mornings. That was the deal I made with myself. Wake up, pull on a long-sleeve shirt without looking, drink coffee, drive to work. Like nothing was different. It held for about 3 days. Then I noticed the sleeves had gotten tight around the forearm. The patches had crept from my wrist toward my elbow. 2, maybe 3 inches of that white crystalline growth moving slow and patient up the inside of my arm. It looked like frost on a window pane, except it pulsed. A low, steady beat, like a second heartbeat slightly out of sync with my own. No pain at all. That was what kept getting to me. Nothing that wrong should feel like nothing. Deliveries had gone nightly by then. Not Monday and Thursday, every single night at 3 a.m., 5 knocks, same patients. I stopped thinking of it as anything and just made the order. Mr. Trosclair left extra cash in the register drawer without explaining. I didn't ask. We were past that stage. Marguerite had stopped coming inside. Her car was always parked on the gravel shoulder when I arrived, headlights off, just her silhouette staring toward the tree line. Some nights she'd wave when I knocked on her window. When she did, The parking lot light caught her hand wrong. Too smooth. Too pale. Like she was wearing a glove she wasn't wearing. I asked about it once. She said the antifungals weren't working. A lab in New Orleans had called her samples unclassifiable. She told me this in a flat voice. Her hands shook when she held the coffee I'd brought. "You sleeping okay?" she asked. I said yes. I wasn't. The dream started the third night after the Fryer incident. Always the same attic, low ceiling, water stains on plywood walls, heat like an oven. Black water stretching to the horizon outside the window. I'd crouch near the glass and watch the flood rise through the floor slats, cold and salt-smelling and sweet underneath, the way fruit smells when it's been submerged too long. Below me, 5 knocks. Pause. 5 more. "Let us in. We just want to come home." I always called back, even knowing I shouldn't. That's the thing about dreams. The part of you that knows better is just a passenger. I started setting an alarm to wake at 4 hours. 4 hours felt safe. The water was still at chest level then. Each morning it had been a little higher than the night before. 9 days before the settlement confrontation, I saw Noah. I was coming back from a supply run to the Walmart in Houma, pulling to a stop sign outside Bayou Vista Elementary just as school was starting. Kids in the crosswalk, crossing guard, waving them through. I was half awake when one of them turned and looked at my truck. Small boy, dark eyes, brown hair needing a cut, blue backpack with a cartoon dinosaur. He'd been laughing at something. The laugh stopped when his eyes met mine and his head tilted. Then he smiled. The corners went too wide. I looked at his shadow on the pavement. Morning sun was low and harsh. The shadow matched his body except the head. The shadow's head had something growing from the top of it, curved and branching. Antlers, clear as anything. His actual head had no antlers, just brown hair. Shadow, antlers, real head, nothing. I blinked and looked back and forth twice. Noah raised one hand and waved at me slowly. From the truck, I could see his teeth when he smiled. Narrow, pointed, like the jaw of a catfish. I drove without waiting for the crossing guard. My hands shook the whole way back. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel, counting the light poles. 4. Always 4. I needed something to stay the same. Patricia Landry called that afternoon. She was the legal aid lawyer helping me with my student loan deferment. The original reason I'd needed this job, back when that seemed like the worst problem I had. She sounded careful on the phone. "I got sidetracked on something," she said. "The Tibito family. I pulled property and death records. Ethan, they're all dead. Officially. Death certificates, coroner's reports, 2005. Drowning, all 32. Bodies recovered 3 weeks after the storm." She paused. "Buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in Chauvin. I have plot numbers if you want them." I wrote them on the back of a Wendy's receipt. I drove to Chauvin before my shift. St. Joseph's was a small parish cemetery, live oaks dragging Spanish moss low over the gate. I found the section near the back fence and walked the row. The headstones had photographs behind glass ovals at the top. Jules Thibodeau, August 29th, 2005. Age 54. Thérèse Thibodeau, August 29th, 2005. Age 51. Marie Thibodeau, August 29th, 2005. Age 8. Noah Verrett, August 29th, 2005. Age 6. Noah's photograph. Small boy. Gap-toothed smile, brown hair needing a cut, blue shirt, squinting in the sun. He looked exactly like the kid at the crosswalk, down to the gap in his teeth. Dead 20 years. I put my hand flat on the stone. Solid granite, warm from the evening sun. I stood there until the mosquitoes got bad and the light was gone, reading every name, knowing every one of them from the freezer and the settlement and the texts on my phone. They'd all been here the whole time. The thing wearing their faces had been at it for 20 years. Had gotten good enough at it that Marguerite, who had known these people personally, had believed it, had touched it, had started growing patches on her palm. I drove back without the radio on. I didn't go in for my shift. I called Mr. Trosclair and he answered on the first ring. Before I could say anything, he said, "Don't do something stupid, Ethan." Quiet and flat, like he'd been expecting this call for weeks. I hung up and drove south. I turned onto the gravel road just before midnight. The cypress trees closed in the same way they always had. The difference was I understood what the feeling meant now. Not discovery. More like walking into something's throat with your eyes open. The settlement looked the same. 12 shacks on stilts, clothes on lines swaying in no wind, light in the windows, smoke from a chimney in July heat. The saltwater smell hit me 50 yards out, sharp and deep, with that sweet dark rot underneath. I got out and started yelling, "I know your names. Every one of you, Jules, Therese, Marie, Noah. I stood at your headstones tonight. 32 graves in Chauvin, 32 bodies recovered from this exact swamp. Whatever you are not those people." 4 seconds of silence. Then the doors opened. They came out one at a time, then in groups. Jules and Terrace, the children in clean clothes, more rising from the water beneath the walkways, black water sheeting off their coats, more from the tree line. I counted to 30 and stopped counting. Their skin had gone completely crystalline, not spots anymore, all of it. That white rippling surface, something pressing from inside in a slow, steady rhythm. Jules's face had stopped holding its shape. The skin hung loose at his jaw, the edges beginning to separate, like a mask worn too many times. He walked toward me and stopped at 6 feet. His eyes were pure black, reflecting nothing. "You found our graves," he said, Jules's voice thick with that wet gurgle underneath. "Then you know we died in that water. We died in our attics waiting for boats that came 4 days late, and the water kept us and changed us." His black eyes moved to my arm, "The way it's changing you." My sleeve had ridden up. The patches on my forearm pulsed harder than I'd ever felt, hard and fast and excited, like something that recognized where it was and wanted to get closer. Jules extended his gray crystalline hand, palm up. "Join us. The hunger goes quiet after the first year. It becomes background, like traffic, like frogs calling, anything you stop hearing eventually. You'll have everyone here, every name on every stone." The loose skin at his jaw shifted when he spoke. "You've been dreaming the attic for weeks. You already know what the water feels like. You're most of the way home." I thought about Marguerite in her car with her white hands. I thought about Noah's antler shadow. I thought about Mr. Trosclair, who had known all of this for 20 years and handed me a laminated card and sent me in anyway. I reached into my pocket and took out my pocket knife. Jules watched me open it. Nothing changed in his expression. "I'd rather bleed out in this swamp," I said, "than let you finish what you started on my arm." I pressed the blade to my wrist, above the highest patch, and pushed until the sting came. The blood that ran out was black. Not dark red. Black. Thick and wrong, like bayou water at midnight, dripping off my fingers into the mud. Jules laughed. That wet gurgle pushed all the way up through Jules's voice. "The water is in your blood already, in your lungs, in your dreams. You can't cut it out." He stepped forward once. The figures behind him moved too, slow and forward-leaning, tightening in from 3 sides. The smell filled my chest. My patches hammered. Then the sky changed. One pale line at the eastern horizon, gray-pink spreading up through the cypress canopy. Then one actual ray of early sun cut across the black water between the shacks. The sound that went through the settlement was high and wet and furious. 30-some voices, a sound I felt in my back teeth. Jules went rigid. He stepped back twice, quick. The others broke for the shacks and the water, nearly running, that forward lean becoming extreme as they rushed. Children and adults, all of them retreating fast. Jules held his ground one moment longer. His black eyes found mine. "The sun goes down again tonight," he said. "It always does." He stepped backward off the walkway. The water barely moved. I stood there with black blood slowing at my wrist, already closing, the edges sealing with thin white crystal, and the settlement was empty and quiet. Clothes on lines, smoke from a chimney, same as it had always looked, patient, waiting. I walked back to my truck. I drove until I hit the highway. I drove until I could see gas station lights and hear traffic and smell coffee from a drive-through, and the ordinary world was close enough to hold. I didn't stop shaking until somewhere outside Gonzales. I don't work at the Wendy's anymore. I moved to Baton Rouge, took what fit in my truck, left the rest. I work days at a hardware store, sawdust and machine oil and nothing alive. I wear long sleeves in August. People notice and I say skin condition, which ends conversations fast. The patches haven't spread since that morning. They haven't gone away. 3 on my wrist, a smear up the forearm, and a new one last month on the inside of my elbow. Pale, pulsing, size of a quarter. Marguerite says the rate has slowed. She doesn't say stopped. She meets me at a diner on Airline Highway every few weeks. Fluorescent lights, bad coffee, laminated menus. We compare patches the way people with the same slow disease compare symptoms. She has them on both hands now, creeping toward her wrists, and one at the corner of her left eye she covers with her hair. She's still looking for treatment, nothing yet. We don't talk about what happens when they reach our hearts. Some nights I drive south without meaning to. Muscle memory or something darker. The patches on my arm start warming when I get close enough, pulsing faster, like something noticing I'm nearby. I've driven past the mailbox 4 times since I left. Always keep going. There's a new orange reflector on the post, bright enough to hurt your eyes in the headlights. The road beyond it has never been paved. It probably never will be. If I crack the window, I can hear them. Not my name, not knocking, just breathing. Slow, wet, patient. Like the swamp itself asleep and dreaming of flood season. It doesn't sound angry. That's the worst part. It sounds like something that has been waiting so long that waiting and sleeping have become the same thing. Last time I drove past, I checked the rear view out of habit. Nothing in the road, just dark and cypress and the orange reflector shrinking in the glass. But the breathing followed me back to the city. I heard it under my window unit when I got into bed. I hear it some nights still, when it's quiet enough and I forget to keep the radio on. If you're ever on Highway 56 after midnight, wrong exit, bad GPS, it doesn't matter, and you see a gravel road on the left with an orange reflector on the mailbox, keep driving. Don't slow down. Don't roll your window down. And when you're clear of it, do not look in your rearview mirror. Because if you see someone standing in the road behind you, gray skin, long coat, wide-brimmed hat, one hand raised, count the fingers. That number is how many days you have left. And you'll know, in the part of your gut that doesn't lie, that they weren't just waiting there tonight. They've been following you for much longer than you think. The water is always rising. The hunger is always watching. And somewhere on my forearm, right now, something that is not my heartbeat is keeping time. I found the clearing just as the sky was going from dark to gray. The gravel road had been going maybe 1.5 miles when the cypress trees opened up on both sides, pulling back like curtains. And there it was. 12 shacks built on stilts above black water that sat so still it looked painted. Tin roofs going orange with rust at the edges. Wooden walkways connecting the structures. Clothes on lines strung between posts. Shirts and work pants and what looked like a child's dress hanging in the dead air. 3 of the chimneys had smoke coming out of them, thin wisps rising straight up in the windless dawn. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Too early for chimney smoke. Too much like someone knew I was coming. I cut the engine and sat for a minute. The frogs had been loud the whole drive down, but out here they'd gone quiet. No birds either, even though the sky was lightning fast and birds in Louisiana are never quiet at dawn. The silence was the kind you notice the way you notice when a familiar sound stops. A clock stopping, a refrigerator switching off. Your body registers it before your brain catches up. I got out anyway. The air hit me like standing in front of an open dishwasher, hot and damp and carrying something underneath the normal swamp smell. Something older and darker, like water that had been sitting somewhere closed for a long time. I pulled my shirt up over my nose for a second, and then felt stupid about it. The walkway to the settlement was solid enough under my boots. Old wood, gray and slick with moss, but it held. I walked out toward the first row of shacks, slow, watching the windows. All the curtains were drawn. All the doors were shut. Whoever had lit those chimneys wasn't showing themselves. On the far side of the clearing, past the last row of shacks, there was a cemetery. 20-some wooden crosses, all of them listing a little to one side the way things list in soft ground. Each cross had a name carved into the crossbeam, rough, like someone had done it with a pocket knife. The date was the same on every single one. August 29th, 2005. I only checked the first 3 before I stopped needing to. The largest cross stood at the center. Someone had spray-painted the wood in red letters, the paint old and faded but still readable. The water took us, but we didn't leave. I stood there looking at it for a while. It looked like grief. Like something built not to live in, but to keep living in. Like leaving was the one thing they couldn't bring themselves to do even after everything. I should have gotten back in my truck then. I know that now. Instead, I kept walking. The shacks were small inside from what I could see through the curtains. Iron cots, oil lamps, shelves with canned goods and folded clothes. One had children's drawings tacked to the wall, crayon houses and stick figures and blue wavy lines that I took for water. All of it was damp. Everything in this place was damp, in the way things get when they've never fully dried out. A deep wetness that had gone into the wood and the fabric and the air itself. On the main walkway, near the first chimney, I found the Wendy's bag. It was one of ours, the red and white striped paper, the same bags I'd been setting by the back door every Monday and Thursday for a month. This one had been torn open and picked clean. But inside, caught against the grease-stained bottom, was a napkin with writing on it. The ink had run, but it was still readable. "Thank you for feeding us. Tomorrow we need 4 bags." More of us came home. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my pocket. 4 bags. More of us came home. That phrase sat in my chest in a way I didn't like. I was still looking at the bag when the smell hit me. Salt water. Sharp and sudden, like standing on a beach in a storm. Not the mild, brackish smell that sat over everything in this parish, but something concentrated and forceful, like the ocean had moved inland overnight. Rule 6 was in my head before my body was moving. If you smell salt water, leave the building immediately. I wasn't in a building, but I didn't think Mr. Trusclair would quibble about that. I walked fast back down the walkway, kept myself from running, got to my truck, got in, got the engine running. I backed out down the gravel road, watching the settlement shrink in my headlights until the cypress trees closed it off. Then I turned around on the main road and drove. When I was about a quarter mile out, I looked in the rear view. 7 figures stood at the edge of the clearing where the road met the trees. Long coats, wide-brimmed hats, very still. I couldn't make out faces at that distance in the morning gray. One of them raised a hand and held it up with fingers spread. 7 fingers. A count, not a wave. I kept driving. I slept 5 hours when I got home. Then I drove to the Terrebonne Parish Library in Houma and asked the librarian, a small white-haired woman named Mrs. Gautreau, for the microfilm archives from 2005 and 2006. She set me up at the reader and brought me a cup of water I hadn't asked for. But when I came back to the desk an hour later and asked specifically about the Tibito and Vere families' swamp settlement south of Bourg, she went quiet in a way that was different from just thinking. "You're not from here," she said. I told her Lafayette, moved back to Terrebonne Parish a few months ago. Then don't go looking for things that have been left alone. She said it the way older people in this part of Louisiana state facts. Plain and without decoration, like the fact didn't need it. You stay away from that swamp, young man. I thanked her and went back to the microfilm. The articles were from the Houma Courier, September and October 2005. About 30 people, the paper called them the Tibito Veray community, had disappeared from a swamp settlement south of Bourg after the storm. They were described as deeply distrustful of outsiders and had declined evacuation. Search and rescue found the settlement flooded and empty. No bodies. A 2006 follow-up said the families were presumed dead, no surviving relatives known. No bodies recovered. I typed that into my phone notes. 30 people. No bodies. I drove home with the radio on loud the whole way. My phone buzzed at 2:30 a.m., 3 nights after the settlement visit. Unknown number. No area code I recognized. We are grateful for the food. We don't mean to scare you. I was mopping the dining room. I stood there with the handle in both hands and read the message 3 times. Then I typed back, "Who are you?" The answer came fast. "We used to live here before the water. We are trying to come back." I thought about the cemetery. August 29th, 2005. Same date on every cross. "Are you ghosts?" I typed. A longer pause. Long enough that I pocketed the phone and went back to mopping. Then, "We don't know anymore." I read that 3 times. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down on a table and finished the dining room with the overheads off, telling myself it was to save power. The fryer turned on at 2:47 a.m. exactly. I stayed in the dining room. At 2:52, it shut itself off, right on schedule. I left the phone face down until the shift ended. The footprints came back 6 nights after that. I pushed through the kitchen door, and the flashlight caught them, wet, barefoot prints on the tile, running from the back door toward the walk-in freezer. Multiple sets this time, at least 3 different sizes. The smallest ones were very small, the size of a young child's foot, the heel marks pooling slightly with water that hadn't fully dried. I had the red mop bucket mixed with salt. I'd started doing that automatically. I stood looking at the prints. Rule 3 said don't follow them. I had followed the rule before. I should have followed it again, but the smallest prints were what got me. A kid's feet on a cold tile floor at 3 in the morning. It pulled at something I couldn't switch off. I followed them to the freezer door and pushed through. The door swung shut behind me. The latch caught. I wasn't worried. Walk-ins have emergency releases, a T-bar handle on the inside wall. Red, you can't miss it. I turned and found it and pulled. It didn't move. Not stuck exactly. More like it had been cold for so long that cold had become its permanent state. I pulled harder. Nothing. My breath was already clouding out in front of me. "Okay," I said out loud to the empty freezer. That had become a habit. Then I turned around. 3 figures stood in the far corner. They hadn't been there when I walked in. I'd had the flashlight on the whole time. The freezer was 30 feet across, nowhere to hide. But there they were. A tall man, a woman in a work coat, a child pressed against the woman's side. Standing close together the way people stand when they're cold, which in a walk-in freezer has a different edge to it. Up close, the white patches were worse than I'd seen them on the security monitor. Not pale skin, something else. Raised and crystalline, like coral, like frost that had grown into a pattern. On the man's neck and jaw, covering the woman's hands almost entirely. On the child's cheek, spreading toward the ear. They caught the flashlight beam the wrong way, like they were lit from underneath. None of them moved. Then the woman said, "We're sorry. We don't want to scare you." Her voice was hoarse, the way a voice gets after too much water in the throat, but calm, almost gentle. "There are more of us coming," she said. 13 now. Some of them are sick. They need medicine more than food." She looked at me steady. "You've been kind to us. We don't forget kindness." The emergency release clicked on its own. I hadn't touched it. It just clicked and swung open. When I turned back, the 3 figures were gone the way fog goes. Not vanishing exactly, just becoming less there, 1 degree at a time, until there was nothing in the corner but cold air and frost on the shelving. I stood in the open doorway a moment. Then I looked at the floor near where they'd been. There was something wedged between the bottom shelf and the wall, half covered in frost. A small jacket, dark blue, child-sized. I pulled it out. It was stiff with salt and soaking wet, the kind of wet that doesn't dry because it isn't from rain. The collar had a name tag sewn into it, the careful kind a parent sews in for school. Noah Verrett. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the prep counter and stood looking at it under the fluorescent light. Then I turned around. All 13 of them were standing inside the open freezer, watching me through the doorway. Different heights, different ages, pressed together in that cold space. Long coats on some of them, bare feet on most. White patches on every face and neck and pair of hands I could see. Their eyes didn't catch the kitchen light right. Too flat, too still. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody blinked. Then they faded. Slow, like the first 3. Less there. Gone. I was left in the kitchen with the freezer door swinging open and a wet, salt-stiff jacket and the frogs going in the dark outside. I looked at the clock. 5:04 a.m. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Trosclair. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice rough. "I need to know what they really are," I said. "Not what they told you. Not what you decided was safe to tell me. What they actually are." A pause. The frogs outside went quiet. "Come back tonight," he said. "I'll bring someone who knew them. Before the water." He hung up. I locked the restaurant and drove home and sat on my front steps in the morning heat for a long time before I could make myself go inside. Mr. Trosclair arrived at midnight. I was mopping the dining room when I heard the knock at the front door. 3 knocks, which was different from 5, which mattered now. I looked through the glass and saw his truck in the lot, and next to him a woman I didn't recognize. Short, gray hair and a braid. She was carrying a medical bag and looking at the building the way a doctor looks at a patient she already knows bad news about. I let them in. Mr. Trosclair looked worse than the last time I'd seen him, which hadn't been good. His hands were shaking even without a coffee cup to blame it on. He introduced the woman as Marguerite Hebert. Nurse practitioner, he said, worked with isolated communities down in the parish. She had rough hands and the kind of calm that comes from seeing bad things long enough that the surprise wears off. "Tell her what you told me," Mr. Trosclair said. He sat down in the nearest booth and didn't get back up for the rest of the conversation. I told her. All of it. The settlement, the cemetery with the same date on every cross, the Wendy's bag with the note, the freezer, the 13 figures, Noah Verrett's jacket. I put my phone on the table and showed her the photos I'd taken the morning I'd driven out there, the ones I'd taken fast before the salt smell hit. Marguerite looked at each photo slowly. She didn't ask me to scroll faster. When she got to the one of Jules and Teres on the walkway, I'd managed to get it through the truck window before I realized what I was seeing. She went very still. "Jules Tobito," she said. Not a question. "That's what the text messages said." "And Teres." She kept looking at the photo. "I treated Teres for a broken wrist in 2003. She was..." She stopped. "These people are dead, Ethan. I attended the memorial. I knew the families." "I know," I said. "The library had articles. No bodies recovered." She put my phone down. She looked at Mr. Trosclair. Something passed between them, the kind of look between people who've been keeping the same secret from different ends. "How long?" she asked him. Mr. Trosclair's hands were still on the table. 20 years, he said, Jules came back first, 6 months after Katrina, knocked on the back door one night, dripping wet, asked for food. He said it flat, like he'd been over it in his head so many times the weight had gone out of the words. He looked wrong, sick. The skin was that color, and there were those patches already. But he was talking, using Jules's voice, Jules's stories. He knew things only Jules would know. He paused. My wife's family came from that settlement. I couldn't. He stopped again. I thought he was alive. I kept thinking that for a long time. Marguerite was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Those people you saw, I knew them, and they should not be walking." She put her medical bag on the table and asked me if I could get her into the settlement at dawn. We drove out there at first light, the three of us in Marguerite's truck. Mr. Trosclair sat in the back and didn't say anything the whole ride. The cypress trees did their thing with the headlights and then opened up into the clearing, and the settlement was there the same as before. Smoke from chimneys, clothes on the lines, 12 shacks on stilts over black water that looked like it hadn't moved in 20 years. 2 figures were waiting on the main walkway. The tall one moved with that forward lean I'd seen before, like something in the spine had gone wrong. He was gaunt, gray-skinned, and his eyes found us before we'd even gotten out of the truck. The woman beside him was shorter, older, and she kept her hands folded in front of her in a way that covered most of the white patches I could see creeping up from her wrists. Jules Tibito and Therese beside him. Margaret got out of the truck first. She walked toward them, and I watched her face as she got close enough to see them clearly. She didn't show much. She had that nurse's control, but something shifted around her eyes, and she stopped moving for just a second. "Jules?" she said. "Marguerite." Jules's voice was hoarse and wet, like he'd been underwater and hadn't quite drained. "It's good to see you came. We've needed someone who knows medicine for a long time." "Your teeth," Marguerite said quietly, almost to herself. I hadn't noticed it until she said it. Jules's teeth were very white. Not just healthy white. The kind of white that has no history in it, no coffee stains, no wear, nothing that 20 years without a dentist would do. Same with Therese. The same with the others who started drifting out of doorways as we walked the settlement. They were all too perfect in ways that were hard to name individually. It was only when you looked at all of them together that the wrongness added up. Marguerite went through the settlement methodically, asking questions, taking notes, shining a penlight in eyes that tracked the beam the way a predator tracks movement, not following it out of reflex, but watching it, deciding whether it was worth the effort. She examined hands and faces and arms. She asked about the white patches. Jules said they had been there since the water, said the whole community had developed them, said he thought they were something the bayou had given them. Near the last shack, a woman named Evangeline sat on a crate outside her door. She was older, maybe 70, and the white patches on her face were the worst I'd seen, spreading from her temple down across her cheekbone, crystalline and raised, almost covering her left eye. Marguerite crouched in front of her and asked if she could look. Evangeline nodded. Marguerite touched the edge of the largest patch with 2 fingers, pressing gently, the way a doctor presses to feel what's underneath. Then she pulled her hand back fast. Not panicked, more like controlled, the way you pull your hand back from a hot surface when you're trying not to spill something. She stood up and turned slightly away, and I saw her look at her own palm. Her right hand, the 2 fingers she'd used. She looked at them for a long moment without saying anything. "We should head back," she said. Her voice didn't change. Mr. Trosclair was already walking back toward the truck. Marguerite put her hand in her coat pocket and kept it there the whole drive back. She got a portable microscope out of her medical bag when we were back at the Wendy's and set it up on the prep counter in the kitchen. She took a sample from her own palm without explaining what she was doing, and I stood by the fryer and watched her work. "What did you feel?" I asked. "When you touched Evangeline?" "Something moved," she said. She had her eye to the microscope. "Under the skin, not a muscle reflex, something that was already in motion, like She stopped. She was quiet for a while. I waited. "This isn't fungal," she said finally. "I thought it was chromoblastomycosis. I was already running through treatment protocols in the truck." She adjusted the focus. "But it's not. It's crystalline. Look." She stepped back, and I looked through the eyepiece. I don't know what I expected. Cells and fibers, the kind of thing you see in a high school biology textbook. What I saw looked like coral or ice. A lattice structure, regular and geometric, with a slow pulse running through it. Not muscle, not tissue, something that had its own rhythm. "It has a heartbeat," I said. "It has a pulse," she corrected me. "Whether it has a heart is a different question." She took her eye back to the scope. "This isn't an infection, it's colonization. Something is growing inside them. Something that's replacing tissue, building itself into the structure of whatever it touches." She pulled back and looked at her hand. "And now it's in me." She said that last part the same way she'd said everything else. Flat and clinical, like she was reporting someone else's chart. Mr. Trosclair, sitting in the dining room booth with a coffee he wasn't drinking, said, "What do we do?" Marguerite packed her microscope back into the bag. "I send samples to a lab I trust, and I look for something that kills it without killing the patient." She closed the bag. "I'll be back." She walked out. I heard her truck start. Mr. Trosclair and I sat in the dining room until he left around 9 a.m. Neither of us said much. He took his coffee with him when he went, still mostly full. I went back to work the following night. I'd thought about calling in sick. Seriously considered it, sitting in my truck in the parking lot at 10:50 with the engine running. Then I thought about rent and loan payments, and the fact that this was still the only job that had hired me in 3 months, and I went in. The first 3 hours were quiet. No footprints. Camera monitor, empty. Back door, solid. The fryer sat cold and still in the kitchen, the way it should. At 2:47 a.m., it turned on. I was in the dining room, same as always. I heard the click and then the hiss of oil heating up, and I sat in the corner booth with the rule sheet in front of me and read Rule 2 for about the 4th time. Do not go investigate. Do not turn it off. Curiosity is how they got the first one. I put the sheet down. I told myself I was just going to stand in the doorway, not go all the way in. Just look from the door, see nothing, come back. That was the deal I made with myself. I walked to the kitchen doorway and pushed it open. The fryer was on, all 4 baskets up, the oil bright and rolling at full heat, which was wrong because nobody had poured oil into the 2nd and 3rd baskets in weeks. The room smelled like hot grease, and underneath that the salt water smell, faint but there, the way it gets when something is close. Something was standing in the oil. It was waist deep in the nearest basket, and the oil wasn't burning it. It was just standing there the way you stand in a wading pool, and its skin was the gray clay color, and it was wearing Jules's face, exactly Jules's face, except the eyes were wrong. The eyes were completely black, not dark brown, not the cloudy gray of the settlement figures, but a deep matte black, like looking into holes in the ground. No reflection at all. It looked up at me. "We've been patient," it said. Jules's voice, but the water was thicker in it now than it had been at the settlement. It didn't sound like a man who'd swallowed water once. It sounded like a man who was made of it. "We've been patient for a long time, Ethan, but we're hungry for more than food now." I backed out of the doorway and let the door swing shut. I went back to the dining room and sat in the corner booth and did not move. At 2:52 a.m., the fryer clicked off, right on schedule. A minute after that, I looked at the security monitor. All 13 figures were sitting in the booths, every booth in the dining room facing the camera in the same direction. Long coats, hats, gray hands on the tables. The child was in the booth closest to the camera. She raised one hand and waved, small fingers, too slow. I looked away. Rule 4 said not to look longer than necessary. My phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. Same one as before. "You have the patches now, Ethan. We saw them when you reached toward the fryer. You're coming home soon." I looked at my right wrist. I'd pushed my sleeve up to my elbow when I reached for the kitchen door frame, and my wrist had been exposed for maybe 30 seconds at the edge of that hot oil smell. 3 small white patches, below my watch band. I hadn't had them this morning. I would have noticed. I checked the monitor again. The booths were empty. I went to the supply closet and got the bleach we used for the bathrooms and pressed a soaked rag against my wrist. The skin went red, then raw. I scrubbed until it hurt and then looked at my wrist under the fluorescent light in the storage room. The patches were still there, faint, luminescent in a way that bleach shouldn't leave anything, and pulsing, slow and patient, the same rhythm I'd seen under Marguerite's microscope, the same rhythm that had nothing to do with me. I put my sleeve down. I threw the rag in the trash. I went back to the dining room and watched the back door until 5 in the morning. Then I drove home and sat on my front steps and watched the sun come up over the rooftops and tried to figure out what I was going to do next. I didn't come up with anything good. 3 weeks passed and the patches moved. Not fast, slow, the way a stain spreads through cloth when you don't catch it in time. They went from 3 small spots on my right wrist to a smear along the inside of my forearm, pale and crystalline, about 3 inches of it by the end of the 2nd week. By the 3rd week, it had crept toward the midpoint of my forearm, and it pulsed, slow, steady, like a second heartbeat running on a schedule that wasn't mine. I started wearing long sleeves to work. Louisiana in July. The other changes. Deliveries were every night now, not just Monday and Thursday. I made the order, pushed it out without looking, went back to mopping. Mr. Trosclair had stopped calling to check in. He left extra cash in the register drawer without explanation. Marguerite had stopped coming inside. She'd park on the gravel shoulder before my shift and stay there. Headlights off, just her silhouette behind the wheel, staring at the tree line where the gravel road started. Some nights I brought coffee to her window. When she took it, the parking lot light caught her right hand wrong. The palm, where the patch had started after she touched Evangeline, had gone almost completely white. Smooth and even, something that looked like skin, but moved like it had different priorities. She was still researching. She hadn't found anything. The dreams started around the end of the 1st week. I'd fall asleep and be in an attic. Low ceiling, water-stained plywood, heat, and outside the window, nothing but flat black water to the horizon. I'd crouch near the glass and watch the flood rise through the floor slats, cold and salt-smelling and sweet underneath in that specific swamp way. Below me, 5 knocks. Pause. 5 more. Let us in. We just want to come home. I always called back, even knowing I shouldn't. The water kept rising. I started setting an alarm to wake at 4 hours because 4 hours in, the water was still at chest level and I could still breathe. 9 days before the confrontation, I saw Noah at school. Supply run to the Walmart in Houma, coming back past Bayou Vista Elementary during morning drop-off. I stopped at the sign while kids crossed in front of my truck, and one of them turned and looked at me. Small boy. Dark eyes, brown hair needing a cut, blue backpack with a cartoon dinosaur. He'd been laughing at something. The laugh stopped when he saw me, and his head tilted slightly. Noah Vere. Same face as in the freezer. He smiled. The corners of his mouth went too far. I looked at his shadow on the pavement. Low morning sun, everything casting long. His shadow matched his body except for the head. The shadow head had something growing from the top of it. 2 curved shapes, branching. Antlers. Clear in the shadow, nothing on his actual head. Shadow. Antlers. Head. Just a kid. I looked back and forth twice. Noah raised one hand and waved. From the truck, I could see his teeth. Narrow. Pointed. Like the jaw of a catfish. I drove without waiting for the crossing guard. Sat in the Wendy's parking lot for 20 minutes with the engine running before I could make myself go inside. Patricia Landry called that afternoon. She was the legal aid lawyer helping with my student loans, the original problem, back when that felt like the worst thing in my life. She sounded careful on the phone. "I got curious about those family names you mentioned," she said. "The Tibito family. I pulled death records. They're all dead, Ethan. Death certificates and coroner's reports from 2005, drowning everyone August 29th. Bodies were recovered." A pause. "Buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in Chauvin. I have the plot numbers if you need them." I wrote them on a receipt. I drove to Chauvin before my shift. St. Joseph's was a small cemetery off a 2-lane road, live oaks dragging Spanish moss over the gate. I found the section near the back fence and walked the row. The headstones had photographs in glass ovals at the top. Jules Tibito, August 29th, 2005. Therese Tibito, August 29th, 2005. Marie Tibito, August 29th, 2005. Age 8. Noah Veray, August 29th, 2005. Age 6. His photo showed a boy with brown hair that needed a cut and a gap between his front teeth I'd seen that morning from inside my truck. Same gap, same face. Dead 20 years. Buried here in ground I could put my hand on. I knew every name on every stone, from the freezer, from the settlement, from the text messages I hadn't deleted. The thing wearing their faces had been doing it for 20 years and gotten so good at it that Marguerite, who had treated Therese for a broken wrist and attended their memorial, had stood on that walkway and believed what she was seeing. I drove back with the radio on. I couldn't hear what was playing. I didn't go in for my shift. I called Mr. Trosclair, and he answered first ring. Before I could say anything, he said, "Don't do something stupid, Ethan." Flat and quiet, like he'd been expecting this call since the day he handed me the laminated rules. I hung up. I drove south. The gravel road was exactly where it always was. I turned in just before midnight, and the cypress trees closed overhead, and the dark got that quality it always had out here. Heavier, wetter, like the air was paying attention. The settlement looked the same. It always looked the same. I got out and started shouting. "I know your names, all 32. I stood at your headstones tonight. I put my hand on the stone. You are not those people." 4 seconds of silence. Then the doors opened. Jules and Therese first, then others from the shack doors, then more rising from the water beneath the walkways, more from the tree line. I stopped counting at 30. Jules's face had gotten worse. The skin hung loose at his jaw now, the edges beginning to separate, like a mask worn too many times. The white patches covered all of them completely. He walked toward me and stopped 6 feet away. His eyes were the pure, matte black I'd seen in the fryer oil. "You found our graves," he said, Jules's voice thick with water all through it. "Then you know. We died in that water, waiting for help that came 4 days late. The water kept us and changed us." His black eyes moved to my right forearm. "The way it's changing you." My sleeve had ridden up. The patches on my arm were pulsing harder than they had since the fryer night. Fast and excited, like something that recognized where it was. Jules extended one gray, crystalline hand, palm up. "Join us. The hunger goes quiet after the first year. Just becomes background, like traffic, like frogs, anything you get used to. You'll have everyone here, every name on every stone." The loose skin at his jaw shifted. "You've been dreaming our attic for 3 weeks. The water is already most of the way home." I thought about Marguerite in her car, with her white hand in her pocket. I thought about Noah's antler shadow. I thought about Mr. Trosclair, who had sent me into this job with a laminated card and 20 years of knowledge he hadn't shared. I reached into my pocket and got my pocket knife. Jules watched me open it. Nothing changed in his expression. "I'd rather bleed out in this swamp," I said, "than let you finish what you started on my arm." I pressed the blade to my right wrist, above the highest patch, and pushed until the skin opened. The blood that ran out was black, not dark red. Black, like bayou water at midnight, dripping off my palm into the mud. Jules laughed, that wet gurgle underneath. "It's in your blood already, in your lungs, in the dreams you've been having. You can't cut it out." He stepped forward. The circle tightened from every direction, the salt smell filling my lungs. My patches hammered. The sky went pale. One thin line at the eastern horizon, then gray-pink spreading up through the canopy. Then one ray of sun cut across the black water between the shacks. The sound that went through the settlement hit me in my chest, high and wet and furious from 30-some throats at once. Jules stepped back twice, hard. The others broke for the shacks and the water, moving fast, that forward lean nearly horizontal as they rushed. Jules held his ground one moment longer, eyes on mine. "The sun goes down again tonight," he said. "It always does." He stepped off the walkway edge. The water barely moved. I stood there with black blood slowing at my wrist, the cut already sealing with thin white crystal at the edges, and the settlement was empty and still. Clothes on lines, smoke from a chimney. Same as always. Patient. Waiting. I walked back to my truck. I drove until I hit the highway. I drove until gas stations and traffic and the smell of normal things were close enough to hold. I stopped shaking somewhere outside of Gonzales. I don't work at the Wendy's anymore. I moved to Baton Rouge, took what fit in the truck, and left everything else. Day shift at a hardware store, sawdust, machine oil, nothing alive. Long sleeves in August. People ask, and I say skin condition. The patches haven't spread since that morning. 3 on my right wrist, the smear up the forearm, and a new one last month on the inside of my elbow. Pale, about the size of a quarter, that slow pulse. Marguerite says the rate has slowed. She doesn't say stopped. She meets me at a diner on Airline Highway every few weeks. Fluorescent lights, bad coffee. We sit in the same booth and compare patches the way 2 people share a diagnosis no one else knows exists. Both her hands now, creeping toward the wrists, and one at the corner of her left eye she covers with her hair. Still looking for treatment. Nothing yet. We don't talk about what happens when they reach our hearts. Some nights, I drive south without planning to, end up on the narrow roads in Terrebonne Parish, and when I get close enough, the patches on my forearm warm up, pulse quickening, recognizing something nearby. The mailbox is still there at the gravel road turnoff. New orange reflector. The road hasn't been paved. If I crack my window, I can hear them. Not my name, not knocking, just breathing. Slow, wet, patient. Like the swamp asleep and dreaming of the next flood season. I've driven past 4 times. I keep going, every time. I check the rear view out of habit, and so far there's nothing in the road behind me, so far. If you're ever on Highway 56 after midnight and you see a gravel road on the left with an orange reflector on the mailbox, keep driving. Don't slow down. Don't crack your window. And once you're past it, do not look in your rear view mirror. Because if you see someone standing in the road behind you, gray skin, long coat, wide-brimmed hat, one hand raised, count the fingers. That number is how many days you have. And know they weren't just standing there tonight. They've been following you for much longer than you think. The water is always rising. The hunger is always watching. And somewhere on my right forearm, right now, something that is not my heartbeat is keeping time. The grocery store smelled the same way it always did. Bleach, cardboard, and something sweet from the candles Senora Pacheco kept burning near the register. I'd been working at Valdez Family Market since I was 16, and at 23 I still knew every creak in the old linoleum floor, every flicker of the fluorescent light above aisle 3 that maintenance never bothered to fix. Some things in Tres Cruces just stayed broken. I clocked out at 5:30, the same time I always did, and pulled on my jacket even though it was still 80-something degrees outside. The jacket wasn't for the heat, it was habit. Pockets deep enough for the small canister of rock salt I kept on me, the kind my abuela used to buy in bulk. 20-pound bags stacked in the pantry like she was preparing for a siege. I supposed she always was. The walk home from the market was about 12 minutes on a good day, 14 if I stopped to check the western sky, which I always did. The sun was still sitting fat and orange above the ridge, maybe 2 hours from Mesa del Sol. Plenty of time. Tres Cruces sat on a flat stretch of high desert in southern New Mexico, about 40 miles from the nearest real city and about 100 miles from anything you'd call interesting. Population maybe 800, depending on who you counted. A gas station, a church, the market, a small clinic, a sheriff's substation where my childhood friend Matt Ortega worked most days. The kind of town that didn't show up on most maps unless you were already looking for it. Most people liked it that way. I was halfway down Calle Bravo when I noticed the moving truck. It was parked in front of the old Henderson property. We still called it that, even though the Hendersons had been gone for 5 years. The house sat near the edge of town, close to where the paved road started turning to gravel before dissolving into open desert. Not the nicest location. The kind of place you ended up if you didn't know any better, or if you just wanted the cheapest rent available and hadn't asked the right questions. The truck was white with a rental logo on the side, back door rolled up. Boxes were stacked in the driveway. I slowed down, not out of politeness exactly, but because I wanted to see who was moving in. A woman came around the side of the truck carrying a box that was clearly too heavy for one person. She was maybe early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a University of New Mexico t-shirt that had seen better days. She was tilting slightly to the right, jaw tight with the effort. I crossed the street. "You need help with that?" I called. She looked up, surprised. The box shifted in her grip and I jogged the last few steps and grabbed the other side before she dropped it. "Oh, thank you," she said, a little breathless. "I told myself I could do this in one trip." "Nobody can do this in one trip," I said. "Where does it go?" "Inside. Anywhere inside, honestly." She pushed the front door open with her foot. The hinges groaned. "I'm Sarah. Sarah Chen. Mariana Reyes." We set the box down in the front room. The house smelled like dust and old paint and something else underneath. Something dry and mineral that I recognized immediately and didn't want to think about. I'd been inside this house once, years ago, before the Hendersons disappeared. It felt different now. Emptier, but not in the way of an unoccupied house. More like the way a room feels when something has just left it. I shook it off. "You just move here?" I asked, which was obvious but something to say. "Today, technically." She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "I'm a technical writer, fully remote. I figured, small town, low cost of living, quiet place to work." She looked around the bare room. "I've been researching the area for a while, actually." "Researching?" Something about the word made me pause. "Just the history, the land. New Mexico has such interesting folklore." She smiled, easy and open. "I like knowing about the places I live." I glanced at my watch. 5:53. "I can help you with a few more boxes," I said. "But I have to be home before dark." She laughed. Not unkindly, just surprised. "It's barely 6. "Sunset's around 7:40 tonight," I said. "Give or take, but I like to be home with some time to spare." "That's very responsible." She said it with that polite smile people use when they find something slightly odd and are trying not to show it. I knew that smile. I'd seen it on every newcomer who'd ever passed through Tres Cruces. We carried 3 more boxes inside over the next half hour. Sarah talked while we worked, about Albuquerque, about the apartment she'd left, about wanting open sky and open space after years of city living. She had an easy way of talking, the kind of person who could make small conversation feel like something more. I found myself almost relaxing. Almost. At 6:22, I checked my watch again. The sun was lower. I could feel it the way you feel a room cooling. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow shift in the quality of the air. The light changed from warm to something harder, something with more shadow in it. I should start heading home soon, I said, setting a box of books down near the window. Oh, stay a bit longer, Sarah said from the kitchen. I was about to make coffee. I've at least got my kettle unpacked. I can't. I moved toward the front door and picked up my jacket from where I'd set it on a box. Listen, I know this sounds weird, especially since we just met, but there's something you should know about evenings out here. She came to the kitchen doorway, holding her kettle. Okay. I tried to think of how to say it. My abuela had always been direct with me, salt across every threshold, iron above every door. But she'd been working with me since I was old enough to understand. She'd had years to build the knowledge into me slowly, layer by layer. Sarah Chen had walked into this town this afternoon. She didn't have that background. The desert wildlife behaves differently after dark, I said. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't close to the whole truth. We've had problems out here over the years. People have gotten hurt going outside after sunset. The whole town follows a kind of informal curfew. It sounds old-fashioned. I know it does. Sarah set the kettle down on a box. What kind of problems? The kind that happen before you realize they're happening. I met her eyes. I'm not trying to scare you on your first night here. Please don't go outside once the sun sets. Keep your doors locked. It matters more than it sounds. She looked at me for a moment, and I could see her doing some quiet calculation behind her eyes, deciding how seriously to take me. I wasn't planning on hiking the desert tonight, she said, with that polite smile again. I have about 40 boxes left to unpack. Good, I said. That's good. Just stay inside. Doors locked, windows closed. Mariana. Her voice was kind. I'll be fine. I wanted to say more. I always wanted to say more, and I never quite knew how. How do you explain something you'd been taught your whole life without ever being given the real reason behind it? My abuela had known the reason. She'd passed on the rules, but I'd never truly understood the architecture underneath them. I knew the rules the way I knew the Lord's Prayer, by repetition, by muscle memory, not by understanding. I left Sarah Chen's house at 6:38. The light was already different, lower. The shadows from the scrubby desert brush stretched long and thin across the road, and I walked faster without really deciding to. My sneakers crunched on gravel. The air had shifted, that thing I always noticed but couldn't quite name, where the warmth of the day didn't go away so much as turn into something else entirely. Something with an edge. I turned onto Calle del Norte, and my house came into view. Small adobe, the same reddish-brown as the surrounding earth, the salt line across the front threshold visible even from down the street, a pale streak against the darker ground. The iron horseshoe above the door that my abuela had hung 30 years ago was still there, exactly where she'd put it. I got inside at 6:54, locked the front door, threw the deadbolt, checked the windows, all latched, curtains drawn. Went to the back door and checked that too. Tested the salt line with the toe of my shoe, making sure it was unbroken all the way across. Then I stood in my kitchen and breathed. It was all habit. 6 months since my abuela had died, and I still did every single step the same way she'd taught me. I wasn't sure if it was grief or survival instinct or both. Probably both. The house was quiet, the right kind of quiet. Indoor quiet, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the house settling in the cooling air. Outside, the desert had its own kind of quiet. The kind that wasn't peaceful. The kind that was waiting. I heated up leftover rice and beans and ate standing at the counter because the table felt too big for one person. After dinner, I washed my plate and looked out the kitchen window. Sarah's house was visible from here, one of the only other houses I could see from my own. Her lights were all on. That warm yellow glow of someone moving through their space, unpacking, making it theirs. Ordinary, normal. I watched for a moment, then made myself stop. At 7:15, I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Sarah's voice, clear and confident, the same way she'd talked in person. "Hey, you've reached Sarah Chen. Leave a message." "It's Mariana from earlier," I said. "Just checking in. Call me back when you get this." I set the phone down and called Matt. "Hey," he said on the second ring. "The Henderson house has a new tenant," I said. "Came in today. Woman named Sarah Chen from Albuquerque." A pause. "Did you talk to her?" "Yeah. I gave her the wildlife explanation." "Did it stick?" I looked out the window at the lit house down the street. "I don't think so." Matt made a specific kind of sound. Not quite a sigh, more like someone bracing for something they'd seen before and didn't want to see again. His brother Danny had been taken 7 years ago. He'd been 17. Matt never talked about it directly, but it was always there, underneath everything, the way old grief settles into the bones and stays. "Keep trying her," he said. "If she still doesn't answer by 8, call me back." "Okay." I called Sarah again at 7:30. Voicemail. At 7:45, I went to the front window and looked through a gap in the curtains, careful not to put my whole face in the glass. That was a rule my abuela had drilled into me. Don't give them a clear look at you. Don't make it easy. Every house on the street had its lights on, curtains drawn. That was just how it was here. Newcomers always found it eerie. Long-timers knew it was the only reasonable way to live. Sarah's house was still lit. I thought about her in there, unpacking boxes, making coffee, listening to music, completely ordinary. She seemed smart. She'd said she'd researched the area, but researching history from Albuquerque wasn't the same as growing up inside it. You could read every article ever written about Tres Cruces and still decide the locals were just superstitious. You'd have to have lived it to understand that the fear wasn't superstition. It was accumulated information. I was 12 years old when my mother walked into the desert. My abuela never used that phrasing. She usually just said, "Your mother is gone, mija," and left the shape of it vague. But that was how I'd come to think of it. She walked into the desert, and whatever happened to her out there happened in the dark, and that was all I'd ever been told. 3 days after she disappeared, something came to our door. 4 knocks, slow and even. My abuela had been in the kitchen, and I'd been at the table doing homework, and she came out of the kitchen before I could even stand up, her hand pressing down on my shoulder, holding me in my seat. "Don't move," she said. "Don't speak." Then my mother's voice came through the door. Her exact voice, the pitch of it, the way she said my name. "Mariana, mi corazón, please open the door." I remember saying "Mama" out loud, just that once, before I could stop myself. My abuela's hand tightened hard on my shoulder. "That is not your mother," she said. Her voice was completely steady. I don't know how she managed that. We didn't open the door. We didn't say another word. We sat on the kitchen floor together for most of the night. My abuela with her iron spike and her prayer beads, me with my face pressed against her arm, listening to the footsteps on the porch eventually move away and then go silent. She never explained exactly what it was. Not that night, not later. She gave me the rules instead, all 5 of them, and made me repeat them until I had them exactly right. "The rules were the explanation," she said. "Everything you need is in the rules." I was still trying to understand what she meant by that. I called Sarah one more time at 7:55. Voicemail again. I set the phone on the counter and stood looking at it for a moment. Then I walked to the front door. The salt container was on the shelf beside the door, an old metal canister with a pour spout filled with coarse rock salt. My abuela had gone through at least a canister a week. Next to it sat the iron spike, about 8 inches long, rough and slightly rusty, the kind of iron that didn't come from any hardware store. She'd brought it from her own grandmother's kitchen in Chihuahua, carried it over the border decades ago like it was the most important thing she owned. Maybe it was. I picked up both. The deadbolt was in front of me. On the other side of this door was the desert dark, and the wrong quiet, and all the things my abuela had spent her entire life holding at this threshold. And somewhere out there, in the lit house down the street, or maybe no longer in the house at all, maybe somewhere she hadn't meant to be, was Sarah Chen, who had come to Tres Cruces looking for open sky and quiet, who had smiled at my warning like it was a charming local tradition. I turned the deadbolt. The door swung open. The night air hit me like something solid, warm on the surface but with a cold current running underneath, the desert beginning its nightly drop in temperature. The street was empty. The sky had gone deep blue-black, stars sharp and bright. In the distance, the flat shadow of Mesa del Sol pressed against a slightly lighter horizon, the kind of dark that had depth to it, the kind that wasn't just the absence of light. The desert was waiting, the way it always waited, patient the way very old things are patient, the way something waits when it knows everything comes to it eventually. I'd grown up with that waiting pressing against every window and door of my life, and I'd learned to press back with salt and iron and prayers I barely understood. And somewhere out there, Sarah Chen was learning why my abuela never told me the whole truth about what lived in those desert nights. The night air hit different from the doorway than it had through glass, warm at the surface, the day's heat still bleeding out of the packed earth, but with something cooler underneath, like cold water moving below the surface of a warm river. The desert gave that feeling off every night, like it was exhaling something it had been holding all day. I stood on the threshold for 1 second. My abuela used to say that hesitation in a doorway after dark was an invitation. You stepped out with purpose or you stayed inside, nothing in between. I stepped out. The salt canister was in my left hand, iron spike in my right. I'd put my abuela's prayer beads in my jacket pocket before I left the kitchen, a small wooden rosary with a dark iron crucifix, worn smooth from years of handling. I'd grabbed a flashlight too, and a second canister of salt. My hands were unsteady, but I noticed that the way you notice weather, just a fact about the current situation. The street was empty. Every house had its lights on and its curtains drawn, the same as every other night in Tres Cruces, sealed up and quiet. I used to think that was just how small towns were. Now I understood the curtains weren't drawn for privacy. I switched the flashlight on but kept the beam aimed at the ground 2 feet ahead of me. High beams at night drew attention. My abuela had told me that when I was small, and I'd thought she was talking about coyotes or javelinas. She might have been. Partly. Sarah's house was a 5-minute walk under normal circumstances. That night it felt longer. The streetlights in Tres Cruces were spaced too far apart, and the gaps between them carried a thickness, a weight in the dark that felt less like absence of light and more like presence of something else. I kept the iron spike loose in my grip, not clenched, ready. The whispers started about halfway there. Not words exactly, the shape of words, consonants and rhythm without anything I could make meaning from. Coming from beyond the last row of houses, from the open desert to the left. I didn't turn toward it. My abuela had been clear on that too. You do not give your eyes to things you cannot see. You do not acknowledge them. I walked faster. Sarah's front door was wide open. Not cracked, not ajar. Wide open, the way a door ends up when someone drops everything and moves in a hurry, or when something moves them. The light from inside fell out across the porch steps and a few feet of gravel driveway, and in that yellow light I could see that the porch chair had been knocked on its side. I stopped at the edge of the driveway and listened. Nothing from inside. The whispering from the desert had stopped too, which was somehow worse. "Sarah?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. Nothing. I crossed the porch and stepped through the front door, pouring a thin line of salt across the bottom of the frame behind me. Not enough. Not the thorough job the situation called for, but something. I kept the iron spike forward. The front room was mostly boxes, the same stacks we'd built that afternoon, but 2 of them had been knocked from the top of a pile near the wall, their contents spilled across the floor. Books, a framed photo, a small succulent plant still in its pot. A floor lamp lay across the couch cushions. Sarah's purse sat on the kitchen counter, strap coiled beside it. Her keys next to the purse. Her phone next to the keys. She hadn't walked out on her own. You don't leave your keys and your phone. I moved through the kitchen, checked the bathroom and the bedroom. Empty. The back door was closed and locked from the inside, which meant whatever happened had happened through the front. I turned back to the kitchen, and that was when I noticed the laptop on the table, open and running, screen still lit. It was a text document, the kind you make when you're organizing notes for yourself. The header read, "Tres Cruces, Disappearances, Working Notes." I stood there and read for a couple of minutes, long enough to understand that Sarah Chen had not come to Tres Cruces by accident. She had a list of names, dates going back to the 1940s, names I recognized from the corkboard at the substation, names that the older residents of this town either spoke in lowered voices or didn't speak at all. Marta Flores, Kevin Yazzie, Alex Murphy, Old Man Hendricks. Dozens more, organized by decade, cross-referenced with locations, conditions, last known sightings. She'd been building a pattern. At the bottom, a note to herself. Local residents follow behavioral protocols that are too consistent to be random superstition. Someone here has understood the mechanism for a long time. Who first figured it out, and what do they actually know? I thought about my abuela, her 20-pound bags of rock salt, the iron spike she'd carried from Chihuahua like it was the most important thing she owned. Who first figured it out? I didn't have the answer to that. I wasn't sure anyone still living did. I closed the laptop halfway so the glow wouldn't show through the windows, and that was when I saw the floor near the front door. Desert dust settled into every room in Tres Cruces, no matter how often you swept. In the thin reddish layer near the threshold, 2 sets of footprints moved toward the door. One set I could match to Sarah, sneaker tread, the right size. The other was different, a wide, flat impression. Even spacing between steps, too even, the stride too long and too regular, like something moving without the small, natural variations of balance that a living body has. I followed the trail out the front door and down the porch steps. On the gravel, and then on the sandy dirt beyond the driveway, the drag marks started. 2 shallow furrows, parallel, heading toward the back of the property where the ground sloped down into open desert. I stood at the edge of the gravel and stared at the furrows and did not follow them. Rule 2. Never enter the desert alone. I had the salt and the iron, but I was one person, and whatever made those drag marks knew this ground better than I ever would. I turned back toward the house. That was when I heard the footsteps from the side yard, slow and even, coming from the dark gap between the house and the low concrete boundary wall. And then the voice. "Mariana? Oh, thank God. Can you help me?" Sarah's voice. Exact. Same pitch, same slight breathlessness she'd had that afternoon while we were carrying boxes. My chest did something complicated. The part of me that had spent an hour with this woman that afternoon responded before the rest of me could stop it. I understood, standing there, how it happened. How people got taken. Not because they were foolish, because the sound was right. because the feeling behind the response was real, even when the thing producing the sound was not. She came around the corner of the house into the light from the open doorway. For 1/2 second, I almost believed it. Then I saw the eyes. Black. Not dark brown, not deep irises in bad light. Black from edge to edge. No white. No variation. Like something wet and lightless had filled the sockets. And the skin. Sarah's face. The exact face I'd spoken to an hour ago, but the texture of it was wrong. Too smooth in the wrong places. Slightly too tight across the cheekbones, like a surface stretched across a form it didn't quite fit. The smile was too wide. The corners of the mouth pulled further than the muscles under human skin should have allowed. "Mariana." Sarah's voice, soft, warm. I got turned around. "I'm so glad you came." I poured the salt across the threshold in a hard, continuous line and stepped back inside. The thing stopped at the base of the porch steps. The smile stayed. But something behind the black eyes changed. The quality of the attention shifted. The pretense dropped for just a moment. And I saw something that had no interest in Sarah Chen looking back at me from Sarah Chen's face. It made a sound. Not a word. Not quite a hiss. Something in between. Then it stepped back from the porch. I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt. Grabbed the laptop from the table with one arm and moved to the window, angling my body so I could see out from the edge without putting my face in the glass. It was still in the yard. Standing. Not moving, not adjusting its weight, no breath rising and falling in its chest. Just standing with the absolute stillness of something that had never needed to perform being alive. I had to go back out through that door and walk home. That thought sat in my chest like something swallowed wrong. But the salt line would hold it at this house. And if I moved fast, kept the iron forward, stayed on the street, I poured a second heavier line of salt across the threshold. Then I opened the door and walked off the porch, turning left toward Calle del Norte. Not running. Running tells things where you are and draws them toward you. Walk with purpose. My abuela's voice in my head, same as always. I was halfway down the driveway when it started. "Mariana." Sarah's voice from behind me. I kept walking. Didn't answer. Didn't turn. Rule 3. "Mariana." Different now. Softer. A register I hadn't heard in 12 years. My mother's voice. My feet kept moving because my feet remembered the rules, even when the rest of me went somewhere else entirely. I was 11 years old for a moment, sitting on the kitchen floor with my abuela's arm tight around me, listening to my mother's voice on the other side of the door. And I walked through it the same way I'd sat through it then. Kept going. Didn't answer. "Mija." Older now. Rougher at the edges, with an accent that lived somewhere below my ribs. My abuela's voice. I was crying by the time I reached the corner. I didn't notice until I felt it on my face. I kept walking. My front door. Salt line across the threshold. Unbroken. Iron horseshoe above the frame where my abuela had put it 30 years ago. I got inside, threw the bolt, leaned against the door with my eyes closed and just breathed until my chest stopped doing what it was doing. When I opened my eyes and went to the kitchen window, the street outside was empty. Whatever had followed me had stopped somewhere before my block. Maybe the salt on neighboring thresholds. Maybe something about the density of iron on enough doors. Maybe it just didn't need to follow me all the way home to know where I lived. I stood in the kitchen with the laptop and my abuela's prayer beads and tried to slow my heartbeat down to something manageable. The knock at the front door made my whole body go rigid. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Then, "Mariana, it's Matt." My cruiser's out front. I went to the window and checked before I moved. Sheriff's Department cruiser at the curb, engine running, lights off. Matt's face, visible through the driver window, turned toward the street, watching. I went to the door, kept my foot against the salt line to hold it in place, and opened up. He came up the porch steps fast. Uniform on, flashlight at his belt, something in his hand. Folded paper, a map, or a printed sheet. His jaw was set the way it got when he was working to keep his face neutral over something that wasn't neutral at all. He came inside. I locked the door. "You went out," he said. "Sarah's gone. Drag marks toward the desert. One of them came to the house wearing her face." I set the laptop on the kitchen table. She was researching. Disappearances going back decades. She knew something was wrong here before she even arrived. Matt looked at the laptop for a moment, then spread his paper out on the table beside it. It was a map. Hand-drawn marks over a topographic printout of the area around Tres Cruces. Red dots, each one labeled with a name and a year. I recognized names from Sarah's document, and others I'd seen on the substation corkboard, and more I'd only heard in lowered voices at family dinners. The cluster spread outward from a central point, an X marked about a mile east of town, near a rocky rise I had driven past most of my life without ever thinking twice about. "My brother drew this," Matt said. "I found it in his room after he disappeared. I've been adding to it since. 7 years of additions, dozens of names, all of them pointing to the same place. Old mining entrance," Matt said, putting his finger on the X. "Sealed in the 70s, supposedly." He paused. "The seal is broken. From the inside. I checked last spring." I looked at the spread of names across the map, the rate of them increasing toward the present, clustering closer together in recent years. "They're running out of room down there," Matt said quietly. 3 taken in the last 18 months alone. Whatever they're doing with them, they need more space. Or they need more... He stopped and looked at the map instead of finishing the sentence. Outside, the desert was quiet in the particular wrong way it had been all night. Somewhere between my street and the edge of the Henderson property, something wearing a familiar face was standing perfectly still in the dark, patient the way very old things are patient, learning. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the table across from Matt and the map, and what we both now knew. I opened the laptop and turned it so he could read Sarah's notes. We stayed there for a long time, working out what we were going to do next. The sun came up and found us still at the kitchen table. Matt had made coffee at some point during the night. I remembered the smell of it before I remembered falling asleep in my chair. My neck ached from the angle. The map was still spread across the table. The laptop closed beside it. The prayer beads coiled near my hand where I'd set them down hours before. Matt was awake, standing at the kitchen window with a mug, watching the street. "Nothing moved all night," he said when he heard me shift. "Not that I saw." I sat up and pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw light. "We need to go in today. We can't wait." "I know." He didn't sound like he was arguing. "I called Cecilia Vargas last night while you were asleep. She's in. She's been ready for years. Lost her brother to the desert back in 2009. And Tomas Aguirre from the gas station. He knows the rules. He'll carry what we need him to carry. 4 of us. Rule 2 said groups of 3 or more. 4 felt better than 3. "Noon," Matt said. "I want to go in at noon. Direct sunlight at the entrance slows them at the threshold. It degrades whatever they're wearing." He paused. "The tunnels will still be dark, but it helps at the mouth of it." I thought about the thing in Sarah's yard the night before. The black eyes, the skin stretched wrong across the face. "It was already wearing her face," I said. "She'd only been taken a few hours before. How is that possible if a copy takes days?" Matt set his mug down and pulled out the chair across from me. "It wasn't a real copy. Not yet." He seemed to have been turning this over for a long time, working toward the words he needed. What Father Medina's old church records suggest is that they can put a face on immediately. Rough, like a sketch made in a hurry. The eyes stay wrong. The skin doesn't fit right. That's what you saw last night. He looked at the map. A full copy, the kind that can pass in daylight and fool people who actually knew the person. That takes days. 3 at minimum. 7 before it's really convincing. It fit. The thing in the yard had been using Sarah's face, but wearing it badly, like a coat 2 sizes too small pulled tight across the shoulders. Not a finished copy. Something in progress. So she's still there, I said. She hasn't been changed yet. If we go today, we have the best chance of bringing her back before that changes. I got up, washed my face in the kitchen sink, and started packing. We met Cecilia and Tomas at the edge of the gravel road at 11:30. The desert was already loud with heat, the kind that radiated up from the ground in visible waves. But it was quiet in the other way. The wrong way. No birds anywhere. I was used to cactus wrens calling from the cholla in the mornings, to lizards darting across the flat rocks along the road. There was nothing moving. The desert looked ordinary at first glance and felt completely empty underneath, like someone had removed every living thing from it and left only the set. Cecilia was in her 50s, short and solid, with gray-streaked hair under a wide-brimmed hat. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder, and I could hear the shift of rock salt inside it when she moved. She'd brought a crowbar, too. Old iron, dark with age. She didn't say much when we met. She just looked at me and gave a single nod, the kind that meant she'd been waiting years for someone to finally do this, and was glad it had come before she was too old to be useful. Tomas was early 30s, with the particular quiet of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had run out of visible anxiety about it. He carried the longest iron bar we'd been able to find, a solid fence post, heavy enough that it took both hands. He held it like he already knew how to use it. We hiked in single file with Matt in front, me behind him, then Cecilia, then Tomas. The rocky rise marked on the map was about a mile out, a low shelf of basalt with scrubby desert willow growing in the cracks. The mining entrance sat at the base of it. From 50 yards away, I could see that the sealed concrete frame was broken. The concrete had cracked and pushed outward, not inward. Something had opened it from below. Nobody said anything. We all noticed. The entrance was about 4 feet high, low enough that we had to duck going in. Matt went first with his flashlight. I followed with mine. The cold hit immediately. Not cool. Cold. The kind of underground cold that doesn't belong to any season, that exists independent of whatever the desert is doing above. It raised the hair on my arms straight through my jacket. The smell came with it. Dry earth, mineral, and underneath that, something sharper. Ozone, the way air smells before a lightning strike. I'd smelled that same sharpness near my front porch once in a storm when I was a teenager. My abuela had pulled me inside fast, without explaining. I hadn't understood until now what that smell meant, or why it was here underground where no weather had ever touched. The tunnel was narrow at first, the rock walls close on either side, old wooden support beams running at intervals, the wood dried to almost nothing by decades of underground air. The floor was smooth in a way that natural rock wasn't. Worn down, used. Whatever had been moving through here had been doing it for a long time. Our footsteps came back wrong. The echoes arrived a fraction too late, and the sound that returned wasn't quite what we'd put out. Like something between us and the walls was absorbing part of the noise and returning the rest, slightly changed. I kept the flashlight low and the iron spike forward and breathed through my mouth. The tunnel opened after about 3 minutes of walking. One moment the walls were close, and then they weren't, and we stepped out into something much larger than the passage had made possible. The main chamber was a natural lava tube. I'd known that from what Matt had told me, but knowing it and standing in it were different things. It stretched further than our flashlights could fully reach in one sweep, a long oval space with a ceiling that arched maybe 20 feet above us. The walls were black basalt, smooth where ancient lava had flowed and cooled. hundreds of thousands of years old. This basin had been volcanic long before any person had a name for it. And along those walls, arranged like exhibits, were the people. I counted 20 before I stopped counting. They sat against the base of the walls or lay on low natural ledges in the rock or were propped in alcoves where the basalt had formed natural shelves, all of them unconscious, all of them breathing. I could see the slight rise and fall in the nearest ones. Their skin had a grayish cast in the flashlight beam, the color of people who hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. They were arranged with deliberate spacing, enough room between each person that you could walk between them, observe them. The spacing of a museum. Cecilia made a low sound behind me. I didn't look back. I moved my flashlight across the faces slowly. Alex Murphy, I recognized from the board at the substation. 3 years missing, early 40s, wearing a flannel shirt that had faded badly. Marta Flores, 8 years gone, small and slight, her hair much longer than the photographs her family still kept in their window. Kevin Yazzie, who'd disappeared 2 summers ago and looked younger in person than I'd expected, barely 20, curled slightly on his side on one of the lower ledges. Old man Hendricks, 5 years missing, face sunken in a way that took me a moment to place. I found Sarah near the middle of the chamber. She was propped against the wall in a seated position, head tilted slightly to one side, still wearing the University of New Mexico t-shirt from that afternoon. Her laptop bag sat on the ground beside her. Whatever had brought her down here had carried the bag along too, which was a detail I didn't know what to do with, like it was being careful to keep the collection complete. I moved the flashlight further along the back wall and stopped. My mother was in one of the alcoves near the far end of the chamber. 12 years. She looked older than the woman in the photographs my abuela had kept on the dresser, but not as much older as 12 years should have made her. The suspended state, maybe. The cold. She was wearing a cardigan I didn't recognize, which meant she'd been wearing it the night she walked into the desert, which meant she'd been wearing it the night I was 11 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and she hadn't come home, and my abuela had found me still sitting there at midnight. I pulled my first salt canister and poured a wide circle around the captives. Matt understood and took his own canister to complete the arc I couldn't reach from where I stood. We made the circle as large as we could manage. Cecilia held the crowbar at her shoulder. Tomas gripped the fence post. The copies came from the side tunnels. I heard them first. That wrong echo again, but this time moving. The sound of things that didn't breathe, but displaced air anyway. They emerged from 3 separate passages on the far side of the chamber, coming into our flashlight beams one after another, and then more after that, spreading along the wall opposite us, stopping where the salt circle ended. There were a lot of them. I knew the faces. I'd seen them on the corkboard, on the missing persons flyers at the post office, in photographs at the town hall. They wore those faces with varying degrees of convincingness, depending on how long the person had been here. The oldest collections were nearly perfect. The features had settled in like a garment, worn so long it had taken the shape of the body beneath. The newer faces were rougher, the skin still not quite fitting right. The ones wearing the oldest faces were the worst to look at, because they almost looked like people, and for a half second in the dim light, your mind tried to find something human in them and landed on nothing. They stopped at the salt line and stood with that complete stillness I had come to understand meant no living body was underneath. When they spoke, it was layered. Not exact unison, but the way a crowd speaks a familiar phrase, voices stacking over each other and filling the chamber from every direction. You shouldn't have come here. Every voice was someone's voice. Every voice was owned by the person whose face stood above it, borrowed or stolen or copied over years. This is our collection now. None of us four said anything for a moment. Matt had his hand on his iron bar. I had the spike. The new one isn't finished, the voices said. Informational, patient. She came here looking for us. She found us. She can stay and be understood fully. We're taking her back, I said. They were quiet. not deciding. They didn't seem to work the way deciding works, more like waiting for something to complete. "Leave the ones who won't wake," they said. "Take the others. We'll forget you came here." Matt was already moving. He went to Kevin Yazzie first, closest to our position, and grabbed his arm, pulled gently, then harder. Kevin's head rolled. Matt tried again, sharper. Kevin's eyes opened, unfocused, surfacing from something very deep. We moved fast. Matt and Tomas got Kevin upright between them. I went to Sarah. Her eyes opened after 30 seconds, the fear arriving in stages as awareness came back to her face, one layer at a time. Cecilia got to Alex Murphy and brought him to his feet through what looked like sheer determination. He stood without speaking, his eyes moving across the chamber without landing on anything. The others didn't wake. Marta Flores, Old Man Hendricks, 3 others whose names I didn't know yet, but whose faces I'd carry out of that place in my memory. I went to the alcove at the back. My mother's eyes didn't open. I tried everything. I said her name in a normal voice, then louder. I pressed the back of her hand flat against my palm. Her skin was cool and dry and completely real, and I held onto it and tried to find words for what I needed to say. "I'll come back," I told her. "I'm going to come back for you. I promise." She breathed steadily in the cold. She didn't hear me. I set her hand down gently and stood up. The copies stood along the salt line and watched with the borrowed faces of everyone they'd ever collected, and they waited. And I walked away from my mother for the second time in 12 years. We pulled back toward the tunnel entrance in order. Tomas first with Kevin, then Cecilia with Alex, then Sarah moving on her own feet with my hand at her arm, then Matt walking backward with the iron bar extended toward the copies that followed along the edge of the salt line, stopping wherever it lay, resuming when it was behind us. I poured as I walked, reading the ground for gaps, keeping the line between us and them. 4 minutes back through the tunnel. 4 minutes of cold and ozone and wrong echoes, and the sound of copies following at the edge of the salt. The light at the entrance was the best thing I had ever seen. We came out into the noon sun, and the desert heat closed over us in a wave. Kevin sat down in the gravel and stayed there. Alex stood blinking at the sky like he wasn't sure it was real. Sarah stood with her arms wrapped around herself, shaking steadily, looking at the broken concrete of the entrance frame. Just inside the shadow, where the sunlight didn't reach, something stopped at the line of the entrance. It wore Sarah's face. Still rough. The eyes had faded from full black to a very dark gray in the roughly 12 hours since she'd been taken. But still not right. Still wrong in the way a face is wrong when there's nothing behind it that is actually that person. It stood without moving. Then it raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Just that. Sarah didn't look at it directly. I think some part of her already knew. "See you soon, Mariana," it said in Sarah's voice. "We'll be waiting." I poured a heavy salt line across the entrance frame and stepped back into the sunlight. The desert was hot and bright and perfectly empty around us, and the sun was directly overhead. And somewhere below our feet in the cooled dark of a lava tube older than any name this land had ever been given, my mother was still breathing, steady and unreachable among the rest of the collected. I turned toward the road and started walking. The walk back to town from the tunnel took about 20 minutes, and nobody talked. Kevin moved under his own power after the first quarter mile, though Tomas kept a hand at his elbow the whole way. Alex walked with the careful look of someone navigating a room they couldn't quite see, eyes open, body moving through the world by feel rather than sight. Sarah kept up with me and didn't try to speak. I didn't push her. There was nothing to say that the desert didn't already know. The clinic was 4 blocks from the market on the main street. Dr. Ruiz came out the front door before we'd even reached the parking lot, which meant Matt had called ahead on his cruiser radio. He had a rolling stretcher and 2 nurses with him. He looked at the 3 survivors, then at our faces, and had the particular steadiness of a man who had spent his career in Tres Cruces and made a decision somewhere along the way to stop being surprised by it. Kevin was the one who needed the stretcher. 2 summers underground was long enough that a mile in full noon sun had used everything he had left. He got on without argument and lay very still with one forearm across his eyes. We followed them inside. The clinic waiting room had those plastic chairs that all clinics seem to buy from the same supplier. Hard, slightly off angle, the kind you couldn't fall asleep in but tried to anyway. I sat against the wall while the nurses took Alex and Kevin to separate rooms. Sarah sat 2 chairs down from me, arms wrapped around herself, looking at the floor tile. She hadn't looked in a mirror yet. I was watching for it. Matt came in about 10 minutes later and sat across from me. We didn't say much. The clock moved in that specific way clinic clocks move, each second given its full weight, nothing hurried. At some point, Sarah said quietly, "How long has this been going on?" "Decades," Matt said. "Maybe longer. Father Medina's church records go back to the 1800s. She nodded like this confirmed something she'd already calculated. Then she went quiet again. I thought about my mother in the alcove at the back of the chamber, the cardigan I hadn't recognized, her hands cool and dry and completely real under mine. I'd set her hand down and walked away, and somewhere between that moment and this plastic chair I'd started carrying, something that was going to be very heavy for a very long time. I left my mother in the dark. I couldn't make that into anything other than what it was. The doctor came out after an hour. Kevin was dehydrated and disoriented, but physically intact. Alex was the same, plus something Dr. Ruiz was calling an acute dissociative episode in a careful voice that meant he didn't have better language for it. Sarah was physically unharmed, which she'd already seemed to know. The doctor went back through the door, and the 3 of us stayed in the waiting room a while longer without anyone suggesting we leave. Kevin's mother arrived at 2:30. She came through the front door at a pace that wasn't quite running and went straight to the desk without looking at us, and we heard her ask the room number, and then her footsteps disappearing down the hall. A few minutes later, we could hear Kevin crying from somewhere beyond the wall, then his mother's voice, low and steady, the kind of voice that meant someone had come back to someone who had been waiting. I stared at my hands and didn't say anything. The town meeting was 3 days later. Matt called it privately. Word passed through families who had been in Tres Cruces long enough to understand the weight of what had happened. Nothing posted publicly. About 60 people in the community hall by the time it started, folding chairs in rows, most of the long-term adult population seated and quiet in a way that felt less like calm and more like pressure building in a closed space. I had never heard the rules spoken out loud in a room full of people before. My abuela had taught them to me one at a time, the way you teach a child something essential. She sat me down, made sure I understood each rule before moving to the next. She never explained the reasons behind them. "The rules are the reasons," she'd said. "Everything you need is in the rules." Standing in that community hall, I understood for the first time what she'd meant, and also exactly where it fell short. Matt stood at the front and laid it out plainly. What the collectors were, where they came from, what they did with the people they took. The tunnels, the gallery, the copies. He'd been carrying this privately for 7 years, adding names to his map in silence, and the relief of saying it out loud in a lit room was visible in the set of his shoulders, even as the words themselves were difficult. The argument started before he finished. Some people didn't believe it. 3 generations of following rules without real explanation had left some families with the behaviors intact, but the understanding stripped out, and hearing the full account now felt to some of them like a story rather than a fact. A man named Garza stood up and said there were rational explanations for every disappearance on the map. A woman named Flores, no relation to Marta, Said the unconscious state the tunnel victims were found in was probably caused by some underground gas, that people had been attributing natural phenomena to supernatural causes in this desert for hundreds of years. Cecilia Vargas stood up and said she had watched her brother dragged toward the desert 11 years ago, wearing his own face on something that was not her brother. Then she sat back down. The room was quieter after that. I stood up near the end. I hadn't planned to speak. But the argument that kept coming back around, the one that said the rules were enough, that if everyone followed them faithfully, nothing else needed to change, was the one I couldn't let sit. I had followed the rules my entire life. I'd been taught them before I was old enough to understand what they were protecting me from. I had lost my mother to the desert when I was 11 years old and lived inside those rules for 12 years afterward, and the rules had not found the gallery. They had not gotten Kevin Yazzie home to his mother. They had not brought back a single person from below that basalt shelf. The rules were never the solution, I said. They were a way to survive long enough to find a real one. Our grandparents and parents followed them because they were doing the best they could with what they knew, but they were buying time. That's all they were doing, and we have to decide what to do with the time they bought. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the air conditioning unit cycling in the corner. We seal the main entrance, I said. Rock salt, iron, concrete. We post people at the secondary ones. Matt's map shows 4 others. We start researching what these things actually are and whether there is a permanent way to stop it. And we stop telling newcomers that the wildlife behaves differently after dark. A few people shifted uncomfortably at the last part. A few nodded. The vote came out 43-9 in favor of sealing. The 9 who opposed weren't in denial exactly. More like they were afraid that doing anything active would provoke something that following rules had so far kept manageable. I understood that fear. I had lived inside it for 23 years. I'd voted yes anyway. The work crew sealed the main entrance 2 days after the vote. Matt organized it with Tomas and Cecilia and 4 men from town who had voted yes and had strong backs. They mixed concrete at the truck and carried it in wheelbarrows and laid iron rebar across the entrance frame in a grid, packed it deep. Over the rebar went a thick layer of rock salt tamped into the concrete before it set. Over that went the final pour, smoothed flat. Matt drove 3 iron spikes into the frame itself. 1 centered above the arch, 1 at each lower corner. It took most of the morning. Halfway through the work, the sound started coming up from below. Not screaming. Not exactly. The sound moved through the cracks in the basalt around the entrance frame and rose into the open desert air, and I stood and listened to it and understood immediately that there was no pain in it. No fear, no desperation. It carried the particular quality of something that had been mildly inconvenienced. The way a person sounds when a door is stuck, not when anything is actually wrong. Patient, slightly annoyed, already calculating around the obstacle. That bothered me more than actual screaming would have. The crew poured the last section and we waited for the concrete to begin setting, and after about an hour, the sound from below faded out. Matt arranged a rotation for Tomas and 2 others to watch the main entrance. He drove out to the 4 secondary tunnel mouths on his map and laid salt lines at each one and added them to the rotation schedule. Below all of it, in the cold dark of a lava tube older than any name this land had ever been given, my mother was still breathing. I drove back to town with Matt, and neither of us said anything for the whole ride. Sarah was at my kitchen table when I got back. She'd let herself in. I'd given her a spare key 2 days earlier. She had her notebook open, pen in hand, coffee going cold at her elbow. She was writing something long. When I came in, she looked up. "I decided to stay," she said. I put my keys on the counter. "Okay. Someone needs to document this properly. The church records are a starting point. Your research from my laptop is a starting point. But there's no systematic account of what these things actually are. Their origin, their full range of behavior, what works against them and what doesn't over time." She looked at the notebook. "And there are people still down there. Your mother, Marta Flores, Hendricks. However a permanent solution gets built, it starts with research. Someone who is here and doing the work. I sat down across from her. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. I checked every mirror in this house before I came inside, she said. The way she said it was honest without being dramatic, like admitting to a habit she already knew she'd have forever. I'll probably do that for the rest of my life. Yeah, I said. Probably. I made coffee and we went through her notes together until the afternoon light started going orange through the curtains. Matt knocked at 5 o'clock and the three of us drove to the edge of town without exactly deciding to. It just happened the way natural things happen when people understand each other. He parked at the gravel turnoff where the paved road dissolved into desert, and he and I sat on the hood of his cruiser while Sarah stayed in the cab with her notebook. The metal was warm under my palms. The sun was moving toward Mesa del Sol, 20 minutes out. Alex still won't look at mirrors, Matt said. Sarah checks everyone she passes. Kevin is home with his mother. A pause. That's something. The desert went through its late afternoon shift. Light going from washed out white to deep gold. Shadows stretching long. Everything clarifying for 1 hour before the dark came. I'd watched this happen my whole life through glass, through gaps in curtains, from behind locked doors. Sitting on the hood of Matt's cruiser with the open air around me felt like something I wasn't entirely sure I'd earned. No more wildlife warnings, I said. No more wildlife warnings, he agreed. Next person who moves in gets the full truth, first day, every rule, every reason, everything we know. It won't be easy to tell. No, but the other way hasn't been working either. He looked toward Mesa del Sol. Your abuela knew all of this. She just didn't have a way to tell you without... He stopped and reworked it. She was trying to keep you functional, frightened just enough to stay alive, not so frightened you'd break. She frightened me anyway. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. She kept you alive, though. The sun touched the edge of Mesa del Sol. I watched it from outside for the first time in my life. Then we got back in the car before the 10 minutes ran out because we were not reckless about it. Not yet. 1 week later, I was walking the early shift route to the market when I saw the truck. White rental, parked in front of the old Garza property on Calle Bravo, back door up. A woman about my age was wrestling a box down the ramp, jaw set with the effort. She looked up when my footsteps crunched on the gravel. I crossed the street and took the other side of the box without waiting to be asked. We set it down on the porch together. Thanks, she said. I'm Danny. Mariana. I'm down on Calle del Norte. I looked at the house, then back at her. Welcome to Tres Cruces. Before you unpack, I need to tell you about 5 rules. She looked at me with the expression I recognized, the polite, slightly uncertain look of someone who has not yet understood that they are somewhere, the old things are real, and the rules exist for reasons. Okay, she said slowly. I'm listening. I told her, not the wildlife version, the real one. All 5 rules in order, the same way my abuela had taught them to me, but with the reasons underneath each one that my abuela had never given me. One at a time, making sure she understood before I moved forward. I told her about the desert after dark, about the things that wore familiar faces and why you did not answer them, about the salt and the iron and the prayers. I told her about the tunnels and what lived in them and how long it had been going on. I told her about Sarah and Kevin's mother crying in the clinic hallway and the concrete we'd packed into the entrance frame. I told her about my mother. Danny stood on her porch with the truck still half full behind her and listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked 3 careful questions. The kind that meant she was taking it seriously rather than filing it away as local color. I answered all 3 honestly. Then I helped her with the rest of the boxes. They were still down there. My mother and Marta Flores and Old Man Hendricks and a dozen others I was still learning names for from Matt's map. Still breathing in the cold dark of that lava tube. still arranged along those basalt walls in their horrible, careful spacing. The sealed entrance held. The salt lines at the secondary mouths held. The iron held. For now. The collectors were old. Older than the mining tunnels. Older than the Spanish missions that had redirected whatever they'd been before into what they'd become. The concrete and salt and iron we'd packed into that entrance was an obstacle to something that had been operating since before the word obstacle existed. They were down there waiting with the patience of things that had no reason to hurry. Sarah was documenting. Matt was watching the secondary entrances for new activity. Father Medina was pulling every old record he could find. We were all working the problem that the town had been surviving rather than solving for over 100 years. At the base of Mesa del Sol, one evening while I was checking the salt line at the east end of the gravel road, I saw the figure. It stood without moving at the far edge of where the flat desert ground met the rocky rise, small with distance. Watching, still in the specific way that living bodies were never still. Then it raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave, the same gesture Sarah's copy had made at the tunnel entrance, and I held the iron spike and looked back at it across the open ground until the light was gone. They were still down there, waiting, learning. And one day, they'd find a way out. When that day came, I wanted to be ready, not hiding behind salt lines and locked doors. Ready